It begins in darkness, deep inside a cave where the air stays cold and still, long after the world outside has changed beyond recognition. Water drips from stone. Sediment settles grain by grain across thousands of years. Ash from dead fires mingles with animal bone-shattered flint scraps of charcoal, the dust of vanished bodies. Time presses down patiently, sealing one life above another, until the cave becomes less a shelter than an archive, a hidden chamber of lost humanity. Then, much later, under electric lamps and careful hands, the buried layers begin to open, and the silence of prehistory gives up one of its most unsettling truths. Modern humans were not alone. Another human species lived here too close enough to touch the same walls, breathe the same smoke, and watch the same winter light die at the cave mouth before vanishing forever. That realization still has the power to feel almost improper, as if it trespasses against something modern people take for granted. To live now is to inherit a world in which humanity seems singular. There are cultures, languages, nations, beliefs, and endless variation within our own species, but there is only one surviving kind of human on Earth. It feels natural because it is all anyone has ever known. Yet the deeper record says that this solitude is recent. It is not the original condition. For a very long time, the human story is broader and more crowded. Other human beings exist beside our ancestors, not as vague shadows or mythic creatures, but as real populations with bodies, tools, territories, injuries, skills, children, and dead. They are not monsters at the edge of legend. They are part of the same family, close enough to resemble us, different enough to follow their own path, and doomed enough that their disappearance will one day seem almost unimaginable. The first hints do not arrive with perfect clarity. In the 19th century, when unusual bones begin to emerge from European caves and quarries, they do not fit comfortably into older ideas about humanity. A low skull, thick brow ridges, massive limb bones, a body built with a kind of compact strength that seems at once human and not entirely familiar. Early interpretations drift between discomfort and denial. Some scholars argue that such bones belong to diseased modern humans. Others try to force them back into known categories because the alternative is too disruptive. The notion that another form of human once shared the world with us, and did so not in a mythic age but in a geologically recent past, is difficult to absorb. It presses against theology, against older histories, against the instinctive human habit of putting ourselves alone at the centre. The bones refuse to cooperate with that habit. As more finds appear from Germany to Belgium to Croatia to France and beyond, a pattern emerges. These remains belong to a distinctive population. They are not isolated oddities. They belong to a people who lived across large parts of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. The name eventually fixed to them, Neanderthals, comes from one famous valley, but the reality behind the name is much larger. Cave by cave, layer by layer, the evidence accumulates until a lost human world begins to take shape. Not all at once and never cleanly. The record is too broken for that. But enough survives to make denial impossible. What survives in the record suggests lives that are both harsh and intimate. Flint flakes struck from prepared cores, animal bones bearing cut marks, hearths once ringed by bodies seeking warmth, teeth worn down not only by food but by work, as if the mouth itself is often used as a third hand. Skeletons with signs of healing after severe injury, which implies care from others, because some of these individuals could not have survived alone. Children's remains, elderly adults, repeated occupations of the same caves across spans of time so long that whole climates change between one visit and the next. There is nothing abstract about this evidence. It is physical, stubborn, domestic in places, violent in others. It does not preserve names, but it preserves habits. It does not tell stories directly, but it leaves enough debris behind to prove that stories were lived here. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the strangest things about this discovery is how long it takes to understand what it means. Early reconstructions often turn Neanderthals into crude foils for modern humans, heavy and stupid, barely capable, somehow trapped, midway between ape and person. That portrait says as much about the biases of the modern world as it does about the prehistoric one. It reflects a desire to make our extinct relatives look obviously inferior, as if their disappearance requires a simple moral explanation. But the deeper the evidence grows, the less secure that caricature becomes. These people make complex stone tools. They hunt dangerous prey. They survive winters that would kill the unprepared. They care for injured companions. They adapt to cold environments with remarkable persistence. Scholars still debate how symbolic some aspects of their lives may have been, and the evidence remains incomplete on many points, but the older image of a dim, stumbling brute no longer survives serious examination. There is a harsher irony underneath that shift in understanding. The more human Neanderthals begin to look, the more unsettling their disappearance becomes. It is easier to dismiss a caricature. It is harder to reckon with a people who endure, adapt, and belong to their world only to vanish anyway. They're not a failed experiment that flickers briefly and dies. They're one of the great, long-lasting human lineages of the Pleistocene. They live through immense climatic swings. They occupy landscapes ranging from Atlantic Europe to parts of Siberia and the Near East. They know the movements of herds, the shelter of valleys, the danger of open ground in winter, the discipline of fire in dark conditions. For a vast span of time, they are not disappearing. They are surviving. The landscapes they inhabit are worlds now mostly gone. Glacial Europe is not simply a frozen wasteland, though it can be brutally cold. It is a shifting mosaic of tundra steppes, sparse woodland river corridors, and sheltered pockets where life gathers. Mammoths move through some regions. Woolly rhinoceroses, bison, reindeer, horse-red deer, cave bears, hyenas, and lions all belong to this larger ecological theatre. Seasons can transform entire routes and hunting grounds. Water freezes, thaws, floods, and vanishes. Wind bites across open country. Caves become crucial waypoints, not because humans live in caves all the time, but because caves preserve what open camps usually lose. In many cases, the best-known traces of these people survive precisely because stone chambers protect ash bone and tools from destruction. The archaeological record, therefore, has its own bias. It shows us Neanderthals, often under rock and earth, though much of their actual life likely takes place in landscapes that leave fewer traces behind. And then there is the genetic evidence, perhaps the most intimate clue of all. Long after the first bones are recognized, science finds another way to listen to the dead. Ancient DNA extracted from bones and teeth begins to confirm not only that Neanderthals are a distinct human lineage, but that they are close to us in a way older generations could scarcely have imagined. The separation between their lineage and ours lies deep in time, but not so deep as to make them strangers. They are relatives, cousins by an immense chronology. And the deeper research goes, the clearer it becomes that the boundary between their story and ours is not absolute. Some of their inheritance survives in living people today. They vanish as a visible population, but not without leaving traces under the skin of those who come after. That discovery carries a quiet shock. Extinction in this case is not total erasure. Still, bones and genes only answer some questions. They prove presence. They establish kinship. They reveal age anatomy and certain patterns of population history. But they do not tell us what it felt like to inhabit that world at ground level. They do not tell us how a Neanderthal child sees a winter plain at dusk, or how fear moves through a hunting party when a wounded animal turns back, or what habits of cooperation bind a small group together when food runs short. Archaeology can gesture toward these realities. It can infer them carefully. It can show the distribution of tools around a hearth, the butchered remains of prey, the transport of stone across distances that imply planning and movement. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the inner life of another human species. That too is part of the mystery. They are close enough to recognize and far enough to remain partly unreachable. So the story opens not with a city in flames or an empire falling into ruin, but with fragments. A skull cap in gravel, teeth in cave sediment, burned bone, flint blades dulled by use, a child's remains in darkness, a sequence of genes preserved by luck inside dense ancient tissue. Each discovery is small on its own. Together they overturn the modern instinct to imagine the past occupied only by ourselves. They tell us that another human species lives alongside us in deep, time-sharing not just the planet but eventually parts of the same landscapes. The world into which our ancestors move is already inhabited by people who are human and not human in the exact modern sense, familiar and alien at once. That is what gives the subject its unusual gravity. This is not only a story about extinction. It is a story about lost companionship at the scale of species. Humanity once has neighbours within its own genus. It once occupies a world in which intelligence, memory, skill and social life are not ours alone. Then the number narrows. One branch remains visible. Another recedes into cave deposits, fossil layers, and faint biological echoes. Much later, we uncover the evidence and discover that our species inherits not only survival but solitude. The bones in the dark do not merely tell us that Neanderthals existed. They tell us that the human world used to be larger than the one we know now, and that recovering even a fraction of that vanished world will require us to rethink what human once meant. Once that first shock settles in, the landscape of prehistory begins to change shape. What seemed like a lonely human past becomes crowded, layered, and far more difficult to reduce to a single line of progress. The old image of one species marching steadily from primitive beginnings toward modernity does not survive close inspection. It is too neat, too flattering, and too simple for the evidence. The deeper record reveals something stranger. For long stretches of time, the Earth is inhabited not by one kind of human, but by several. Some live far apart and never meet. Some overlap in time, but not in place. Some share borders, climates, prey, and perhaps knowledge. The human world is once plural. That plurality stretches deep into the Pleistocene, into a span of time so vast that ordinary historical language begins to fail. Kingdoms and empires rise and vanish in mere instants by comparison. Over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, the genus Homo branches and spreads. Populations move out of Africa, adapt to new environments, become isolated, reconnect, shift, and diverge again. Evolution does not proceed like a ladder, with one figure always replacing the last in a clean upward ascent. It behaves more like a braided river, dividing into channels, some broad and persistent, some narrow and short-lived, some rejoining others, fading into the ground. What survives in the record suggests that this branching is not an exception. It is the rule. Long before Homo sapiens begins its eventual expansion, across most of the planet, earlier humans have already shown extraordinary restlessness. Homo erectus, or closely related populations often grouped around that name, spreads far beyond Africa and becomes one of the great pioneers of early human history. These people endure for immense spans of time and across large distances, leaving traces from Africa into parts of Eurasia. Their success alone should warn against any simplistic view of our own species as the only true global experiment. They are followed and perhaps partially give rise to later human populations whose relationships scholars still debate in detail. Some fossils fit neatly into older categories only until a new discovery unsettles the boundaries again. A jaw in one region, a skull in another, a set of teeth that seem oddly mixed in their features. The evidence remains incomplete, and paleoanthropology has an almost endless capacity for argument, but the broad conclusion is now hard to avoid. The past contains more humankinds than the present. In Western Eurasia, one of those branches gradually becomes the Neanderthals. They do not appear overnight as a finished type. Their lineage emerges over long periods from earlier populations often grouped under names such as Homo heidelbergensis, or related Middle Pleistocene humans, though scholars still debate the exact labels and relationships. What matters is not the taxonomic quarrel, so much as the slow shaping of a people by time, geography and climate. Over many thousands of years, populations in Europe and nearby regions become increasingly specialized for the demands of those environments. By the time clearly recognizable Neanderthals dominate much of Europe and Western Asia, they are already heirs to a long regional history. They belong to those landscapes in the deep sense not as recent arrivals, but as lineages weathered into place. Elsewhere, the picture becomes even stranger. In Siberia, and likely across parts of Asia far beyond what a few fragmentary fossils alone would suggest, another human population leaves behind a ghostly but unmistakable signature. They are now called Denisovans, named after Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, where some of the most important evidence first comes to light. For a long time, the astonishing thing about them is how little of them is visible in the conventional way. A finger bone, a few teeth, later a jaw from the Tibetan plateau. That does not sound like enough to identify a human population of major importance, and for earlier generations it would not have been. But ancient DNA changes the scale of what can be known. From tiny fragments, researchers recover a genetic history, indicating that Denisovans are distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans, yet related closely enough to all that the family resemblance is unmistakable. An entire human branch steps into view, not through a grand skeleton laid out under museum glass, but through molecules hidden in ancient tissue. And they are not alone. On islands in Southeast Asia, even more surprising forms appear. Homo floresiensis, discovered on Flores, is small-bodied enough to have been sensationally nicknamed in popular culture, though the nickname does not help much in understanding the science. What matters is that this population exists at all. It reminds us that isolation can produce human variants no straight-line narrative would have predicted. Another group, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, remains even more fragmentary and uncertain, but its existence pushes the same unsettling point. The human story is not only crowded, it is experimentally diverse. Different populations adapt to different ecological pressures, and some do so in ways that seem almost unbelievable until the bones are in hand. By the late Pleistocene, when our own species begins to expand beyond Africa in ways that will permanently reshape the planet, this human map is still populated. Neanderthals occupy large swathes of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovan-related populations appear to persist somewhere across parts of Asia, though their full range remains one of the great unresolved questions. Small-bodied island hominins may still survive in isolated pockets. Other archaic populations known only faintly through genetics or scattered fossils may also linger longer than the older textbooks once allowed. Scholars still debate how many distinct species or subspecies should be recognized, because the categories themselves can be blunt tools imposed on a messier reality. But whether one prefers to speak of species lineages or human populations, the essential point remains the same. Homo sapiens enters a world where other humans already exist. That fact changes the emotional texture of prehistory. It means that when early modern humans move into unfamiliar valleys, follow coasts, cross grasslands, or camp beside river systems in Eurasia, they're not always the only upright, tool-making, fire-using people on the land. Somewhere beyond the ridge, or across the seasonal range of migrating game, another group may be doing much the same. Not identically and not with the same tools or bodies or histories, but with enough similarity to make the old modern idea of absolute human uniqueness feel very recent indeed. There are periods when two or more kinds of human share the same continent. In some places, they almost certainly share the same wider ecosystems at the same time. The human condition during those ages is not singular, it is shared. What the sharing looks like on the ground is much harder to reconstruct. Small populations can remain far apart even within the same broad region. Harsh terrain climate barriers and sheer distance matter enormously in prehistory. The existence of overlap in time does not necessarily imply daily contact, yet neither does it permit the old fantasy of isolated successions in which one human species politely exits the stage before the next arrives. The boundaries are not so clean. One lesser known and striking detail is that a child found in Denisova cave turns out through genetic analysis to have had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. That single individual known from a bone fragment confirms with breathtaking intimacy that separate human lineages do not merely coexist in abstract diagrams. They sometimes meet in the most direct possible way. No single explanation fully accounts for how often such encounters occur across prehistory. But even rare cases are enough to shatter the image of sealed-off human worlds. The environments in which these different people live are unstable enough to complicate everything further. Glacial cycles advance and retreat. Forests contract and spread. Grasslands open, then fragment. River systems alter routes. Sea levels fall and rise, exposing land bridges and then drowning them again. A map of human populations in one period will not hold for the next. Animals shift range in response, and humans shift with them or perish. This constant rearrangement helps explain why the prehistoric world can support multiple human lineages for so long, and also why those lineages can become isolated enough to diverge. Geography does not stand still. Climate does not stand still. Human evolution unfolds inside moving corridors and shrinking refuges rather than on a stable board. That wider context matters because Neanderthals are not simply the other humans in a vague symbolic sense. They are one branch in a much more tangled family drama. To understand them properly, it helps to see that they belong to a crowded age, not an empty one. Their eventual disappearance is striking not merely because a species went extinct, but because it happened within a world where several human kinds had once found ways to endure. The question is not why prehistory produces diversity. It clearly does. The harder question is why that diversity collapses until only one human species remains visible almost everywhere. Why do all the other branches disappear? Why does the braided river narrow to one surviving channel? For now, the answer lies ahead. At this stage, the important thing is to see the setting clearly. Ice Age Eurasia is not the backdrop for a solo human adventure. It is a vast and shifting arena in which multiple human lineages have histories of their own. Some are local specialists, some are wide-ranging survivors, some are so elusive that science identifies them only through fragments and genes. Into that crowded world our own species will expand, adapt, mingle, compete and endure. But before the meeting comes, there is the matter of understanding one of those neighbouring branches on its own terms. Because if Neanderthals are to become more than a famous name attached to heavy brows and museum skeletons, they have to be seen first as what they truly are not: failed. Modern humans, not half-made people, but one of the great human populations of the ancient world, shaped by cold stone and time into something powerful, capable and unmistakably real. Cold leaves its mark on everything. It shapes the land first, pressing ice across the north, lowering sea levels, shifting winds, drying some regions into open steppe, while allowing pockets of woodland and sheltered valleys to persist elsewhere. It governs where herds move, where water holds, where predators gather, where shelter matters most. Then it begins shaping bodies as well, generation after generation, until a people emerge who seem built not for comfort, but for endurance in a difficult world. By the time Neanderthals become fully recognizable in the fossil record, they carry that long education in their bones. They are not simply humans living in cold places. They are humans profoundly formed by them. Their bodies look different from ours in ways that are impossible to miss once the bones are laid out clearly. Neanderthals are generally shorter and more powerfully built than many modern human populations, with broad chests, thick limb bones, wide shoulders, and strong muscle attachments that suggest repeated heavy physical effort. Their arms and legs tend to be somewhat shorter in their lower segments than those of many Homo sapiens populations, a trait often associated with conserving heat in colder climates. Their faces project forward more than ours with large noses and distinctive brow ridges above the eyes. Their skulls are long and low rather than high and rounded. None of this makes them less human. It makes them differently adapted. The old habit of turning an anatomical difference into a ladder of worth says more about modern prejudice than prehistoric reality. A body like that is expensive. It demands calories. It reflects a life of exertion in which survival depends not on delicacy or efficiency in the modern sense, but on strength, toughness, and the ability to function in environments where winter is not an inconvenience but a governing force. What survives in the record suggests that Neanderthals are often close-range hunters of large game, and that way of life carries risks written directly into their skeletons. Broken ribs, healed fractures, injuries that resemble those of modern rodeo riders, or others dealing with large, dangerous animals at close quarters. These are not casual foragers drifting through generous landscapes. These are people who meet bison, horse, deer, and perhaps occasionally larger prey in difficult terrain with stone-tipped weapons that require skill and nerve rather than comfortable distance. Scholars still debate exactly how much hunting technology varies across time and region, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the image that emerges is one of physical courage woven into daily necessity. The climates they endure are not uniform. Neanderthals live across a wide range stretching from Atlantic Europe into Western Asia and beyond, and conditions differ sharply from one place to another, and from one period to the next. There are milder intervals, forested zones, river valleys rich in seasonal resources, and Mediterranean pockets where winter is less punishing than on the open plains farther north. Still, their broader world is one of instability. Glacial phases can make familiar regions harsher and more fragmented. Resources shift, animal populations move, open landscapes expand then contract. A group that knows one hunting circuit well may find it transformed within the span of generations. Adaptation in this context is not simply a matter of having the right body. It requires intimate environmental knowledge, flexibility within limits, and the social ability to transmit survival knowledge accurately enough to matter. Stone tools become part of that adaptation, and in Neanderthal hands they are neither crude nor random. Their toolkit is most often associated with what archaeologists call the Mousterian tradition, though even that label can hide considerable regional variation. Stone is selected, prepared, struck, and shaped with planning. In many cases, Neanderthals use methods such as the Levallois technique, in which a core is carefully prepared so that flakes of predictable size and shape can be removed. That does not happen by accident. It reflects foresight practice and a clear understanding of material properties. A discarded flake in a cave layer can look unimpressive to an untrained eye, but to archaeologists it may preserve the trace of a mind thinking several steps ahead. One lesser-known detail is that some Neanderthal groups transport selected raw materials across notable distances, which suggests they're not merely reacting to whatever lies at hand, but organizing movement and tool production strategically. Wood, hide, sinew and plant fibers rarely survive as well as stone, which means the archaeological record almost certainly understates the full complexity of Neanderthal technology. That bias matters. Stone endures because it is hard, everything else vanishes more easily. So a prehistoric people can look more primitive than they truly are simply because their softer technologies rot away. What survives in the record suggests the use of wooden spears in at least some context, the controlled use of firehide working, and perhaps adhesives made from substances such as birch bark tar. The latter is especially revealing. Producing tar requires controlled heating under specific conditions. It is not flashy technology, but it is a subtle one involving process patience and repeatable technique. Neanderthals do not leave behind metal writing or architecture on a monumental scale, but that absence should not distract from the sophistication required to live successfully in the environments they inhabit. Fire sits near the center of that success. In cold climates, fire is not merely warmth. It is protection from predators, a way to process food, a means of extending activity into dark hours, a focus of group life, and perhaps just as importantly a marker of knowledge carried across generations. Hearths survive in caves and open-air sites as darkened patches of ash charcoal, reddened sediment and burnt bone. Around them gather the traces of making and eating and waiting. Fire can dry hides, harden wooden points, thaw-numbed hands, and transform a shelter from a temporary stop into something like a lived place. Scholars still debate how continuous or universal fire use is across different Neanderthal populations and time periods, because preservation is uneven and the evidence remains incomplete, but there is no serious doubt that fire plays a major role in many Neanderthal settings. Their adaptation reaches beyond tools and into metabolism and diet. Isotope studies of Neanderthal bones often suggest a heavy reliance on animal protein, particularly from large herbivores, though this too varies by place and circumstance. In some regions and seasons they also consume plants, nuts, mushrooms, and perhaps small game fish or shellfish, more than older stereotypes once allowed. One surprising detail from dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, is that it can preserve microscopic traces of food and environment, offering glimpses of what enters Neanderthal mouths tens of thousands of years ago. That kind of evidence has helped complicate the old image of them as nothing but big game specialists. They are certainly capable hunters, but like many successful foragers, they probably adjust within the possibilities available to them. Still, their bodies appear to require substantial energy, and that dependence on calorie-rich food may become an important vulnerability when ecosystems begin to shift more violently. The human cost of this life is visible in other ways too. Neanderthal skeletons often show wear that suggests repeated strenuous activity from an early age. Teeth are heavily used sometimes as gripping tools in working hides or other materials. Bones preserve signs of stress trauma and healing. Some individuals survive serious injuries long enough for their bodies to repair them, which implies not only resilience but social support. A badly injured hunter who lives on does not do so by grit alone. Someone brings food, someone shares warmth, someone adjusts the group's burden around that damaged body. That is one of the quiet but important truths hidden in prehistoric bone. Care leaves traces even when affection does not, There is also the matter of childhood, which deep time tends to blur. Yet Neanderthals do not appear in the world as fully formed adults carrying spears into winter fog. They begin as dependent children in small groups, where learning has immediate consequences: how to strike stone properly, how to read tracks in snow or mud, which season a valley fills with game and which season it becomes a trap of cold wind and scarce food, how close to approach a wounded animal, which plants are worth gathering, where to find shelter before weather breaks. None of this is instinct alone. It is culture in the broadest sense, knowledge accumulated and transmitted. The exact richness of Neanderthal language remains unknown, and scholars still debate what can safely be inferred, but no single explanation of their survival makes sense without some robust system of communication and teaching. People do not endure for hundreds of thousands of years in unstable environments by accident. To picture Neanderthals properly, then, is to set aside the cartoon and return them to their actual world. They are not primitive because they lack what comes later. They are specialized. They are inhabitants of glacial margins, wooded ravines, limestone caves, river crossings, and hunting grounds that demand strength, memory, and coordination. Their bodies reflect prolonged adaptation to cold conditions. Their tools reflect planning and skilled hands. Their survival reflects cooperation. For a very long time, that combination works. It works well enough that they remain one of the dominant human populations of Eurasia, across spans of time so long they are hard to hold in the mind. This is what makes the later disappearance so difficult to explain simply. A people shaped by cold and stone are not easy to erase, and yet the same adaptations that make Neanderthals formidable may also bind them tightly to a particular style of life. Strong bodies require resources. Hunting systems depend on landscapes behaving within known limits. Small groups may be resilient in some ways and fragile in others. Environmental knowledge that is extraordinarily effective in one set of conditions may become less so when climates lurch, prey shifts range, and another human population enters the same broader world with different social networks and strategies. Those pressures lie ahead. For now, the essential truth is more immediate. Neanderthals belong to their world completely. They are not visitors there. They are among the finest cold-weather humans the planet has ever produced, shaped over ages into a form that matches the demands of Ice Age Eurasia with impressive precision. To understand what vanishes later, it is necessary first to see how much had once been built to endure. What makes the Neanderthal story harder to dismiss is not only that they survive in harsh landscapes, but that the closer researchers look, the less they resemble the old stereotype that once stood in for them. The brutish figure of popular imagination, all instinct and no depth, has been eroding for decades under the weight of actual evidence. It lingers because it is simple, and because simple ideas about the past are often the last to die. But Neanderthals do not fit neatly into the role of humanity's clumsy rehearsal. They are too competent, too adaptable, and in some ways too familiar. What survives in the record suggests lives structured by skill, memory, obligation, and a social world far richer than earlier generations wanted to allow. The stereotype begins to collapse the moment daily life comes into focus. A people do not persist for hundreds of thousands of years across difficult environments by blundering from one emergency to the next. Survival on that scale requires systems. It requires cooperation that outlasts individuals' knowledge, that moves across generations, and habits stable enough to teach children how to read a landscape before that landscape kills them. Neanderthal camps may not leave behind cities or monuments, but they do leave patterns, hearths placed and reused, tool debris clustered where work is done, animal remains processed with precision, raw materials carried from elsewhere. In some caves, the repeated use of certain zones suggests that activity is not random. Space is organized. Fire occupies one place, butchery another, toolmaking another. Even where the evidence remains incomplete, these traces imply not merely presence but structure. Care for the vulnerable may be the most humanizing clue of all, though perhaps that word is misleading because the point is precisely that humanity is broader here than modern habits assume. Some Neanderthal skeletons preserve signs of injuries so severe that survival without help seems unlikely. Broken bones heal. Damaged limbs are lived with. One of the most famous examples from Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq involves an individual who appears to have suffered multiple impairments, including injuries that may have affected an arm or leg, and perhaps vision or hearing, yet survived for years afterward. Scholars still debate the exact medical interpretation of some of these remains, and no single case should be turned into sentimental certainty. Even so, what survives in the record suggests that injured individuals are not always abandoned as soon as they become burdens. Someone makes room for them. Someone slows down enough to keep them alive. That matters because care is costly in a world like theirs. Food is not abundant by default. Winters are serious. Hunting is dangerous. The margin for waste is thin. To sustain an injured or elderly person in such conditions implies more than passive tolerance. It implies decision. A group must judge that a damaged body still belongs inside the circle of obligation. That may be because the injured person retains useful knowledge, because kinship imposes responsibility, because emotional bonds matter, or because all three are inseparable. The exact motive is beyond recovery, but the action survives in bone. Neanderthal life, then, is not simply physical survival in the rawest sense. It includes endurance through one another. Their tools also refuse the stereotype. Mousterian technology is not ornamental, but it is skilled. Neanderthals shape flakes for specific purposes, retouch edges, select materials, and in some cases use composite technology that likely joins stone to wood with adhesives. That last point is easy to overlook because it lacks spectacle, yet it is revealing. Birch bark tar, which appears at some Neanderthal sites, requires a controlled process to produce. It is not found ready-made in the form needed for hafting. It has to be made. That means planning, repeatable technique and practical chemistry carried without written instruction. There is a tendency in modern culture to reserve the word sophistication for technologies that resemble our own. Prehistory asks for a humbler standard. If a process is difficult, intentional, and transmitted across generations, it deserves respect whether or not it ends in steel. The same is true of hunting. For a long time, Neanderthals are imagined as reckless ambushers, relying on brute strength because they supposedly lack the cognitive flexibility for anything more refined. The truth is more complicated. There is strong evidence that they often hunt large game at relatively close range, which certainly carries danger, but danger is not the same as stupidity. Close-range hunting in rough environments requires coordination planning, understanding of animal behavior, and the ability to exploit terrain. A narrow pass, a muddy edge, a cliff line, deep snow, a river crossing at the wrong season, all can turn the balance between hunter and prey. The injuries visible in some Neanderthal remains may reflect the risks of that work, but they also testify to repeated engagement with it. These are practiced hunters in worlds where failure is expensive. Then there is the matter of symbol ritual and inner life, where caution becomes especially important because speculation can outrun evidence. Scholars still debate how far Neanderthal symbolic behavior extends, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the old certainty that they possess none of it has become difficult to defend. Pigments appear at some sites. Modified feathers and eagle talons have been interpreted by some researchers as ornaments or objects with meanings beyond mere utility. Burials are especially contested. A body placed in a pit does not automatically prove religion, and popular accounts have often rushed too quickly into romantic conclusions. Yet some Neanderthal dead do appear to have been deliberately deposited rather than casually discarded. That does not tell us exactly what they believed, if belief is even the right modern word, but it suggests that the dead are not always treated as refuse. Some distinction is being made. One lesser-known and quietly striking clue comes from caves where broken stalagmites or modified spaces hint at activity not obviously reducible to immediate survival. Such finds remain controversial in their interpretation, and no single explanation fully accounts for them, but they widen the range of what must be considered possible. The question is no longer whether Neanderthals can do anything beyond the strictly practical. The question is how much of that behavior can be demonstrated securely, and how much vanished with the softer materials, gestures, sounds, and social meanings that archaeology almost never preserves. Symbolic life, if it exists, is among the easiest human realities to lose. This stereotype also collapses under the evidence of diet and domestic routine. Neanderthals are not merely pursuing mammoths through blizzards every day of their existence. They process hides. They likely prepare plant foods when available. Dental calculus preserves traces of starch grains and other microscopic residues that complicate the old image of an exclusively meat-driven existence. In some regions, coastal resources appear to matter. In others, mushrooms, nuts, or cooked plant materials enter the picture. Variation matters here. A people spread across such a wide territory will not live identically everywhere. The larger truth is that Neanderthal life is ecological and local. It bends to forest steppe, coast valley, and season. That is exactly what a capable human population would do. Even their childhoods, barely visible though they are, argue against the stereotype. A Neanderthal child has to learn a demanding world early. Tool skills do not appear by instinct. Safe movement through a landscape of predators and unstable weather does not appear by instinct. The use of fire, the handling of hides, the recognition of stone worth carrying, the memory of migration routes, the reading of tracks, the social rule of the group, all of this must be taught or absorbed through imitation. Childhood in such a setting is not an irrelevant prelude to adulthood. It is the means by which the culture reproduces itself. What survives in the record suggests a people whose way of life depends on sustained learning, and learning depends in turn on attention, communication, and social continuity. So the old image gives way to something more substantial and in a way more haunting. Neanderthals are not memorable because they are crude. They are memorable because they are close, not identical to us, not interchangeable with us, but close enough that the distance between their world and ours can no longer be filled with easy contempt. They make mend, teach, hunt, endure, and care. They occupy time deeply enough to develop regional traditions and habits. They leave behind traces of both hardship and belonging. The evidence does not turn them into modern people in animal skins, and it should not. They remain their own kind of human, shaped by their own environments and history. But the closer their lives come into view, the harder it becomes to see their disappearance as inevitable or simple. And that is where the mystery begins to sharpen. A species of obvious resilience, intelligence, and social depth does not fit comfortably into a story of natural inferiority. If Neanderthals vanish, the reason is unlikely to be that they are too dull to survive. Something more complicated is coming into the picture. Their world works for a very long time. It sustains families, memories, practical knowledge, and communities across ages. The harder question is not whether they are fully real as people. The evidence has already answered that. The harder question is what happens when a people this capable, this established, and this deeply rooted in their own landscapes begin to face pressures their old strengths cannot entirely solve. The grand scale of prehistory can make vanished people seem abstract, as if they belong only to climate charts, museum cases, and timelines drawn across maps. But real lives are always smaller at ground level. They happen within the ring of a fire, in the dark stretch before dawn, in the carrying of water, in the cleaning of a hide, in the ache left by a healed fracture when the weather changes. Neanderthal existence, for all its deep time mystery, is built out of these immediate things. Shelter must be found or made before night closes in. Fuel must be gathered before cold settles too hard. Meat must be cut before it spoils. Children must be watched. Wounds must be endured. The world outside may be immense and unstable, but life itself contracts each day into a set of practical decisions that mean the difference between warmth and exposure, nourishment and hunger, safety and the sound of predators moving just beyond the light. Caves survive best in the record, so caves loom large in the imagination, but they are only part of the story. Neanderthals are not cave creatures in the cartoon sense, bound permanently to darkness. Caves matter because they offer reliable shelter and because they preserve evidence. A limestone chamber can hold traces of fire, bone and stone for tens of thousands of years in a way an open camp rarely can. Yet much of Neanderthal life almost certainly unfolds outside these protected places. They move across valleys, ridges, forest margins, riverbanks and open plains, stopping where water, prey season and weather make a temporary life possible. In some places they may build simple shelters from wood, hide, brush and whatever else the landscape offers, but such structures almost never survive clearly. Archaeology catches only glimpses, a pattern of post holes here, a scatter of bones, there a ring of activity too deliberate to be random. The evidence remains incomplete, and much of their ordinary architecture is probably lost beyond recovery. Even so, what survives suggests that Neanderthals know how to make places livable. A hearth is not merely a fire. It is the centre around which a temporary world is organised. Around it tools are repaired, meat is cooked, stories may be passed if language carries that far bodies warm themselves after work in snow or rain, and darkness becomes less absolute. Fire also creates a boundary. Beyond it lie cold predators and uncertainty. Within it lies a human zone, fragile but real. Charcoal and ash recovered from caves and open-air sites preserve the residue of that repeated transformation. Fire reddens, sediment blackens, bone hardens, wood softens food and extends the day. In difficult climates it is less a convenience than a condition of survival. Scholars still debate how constant fire use is in every region and period, because evidence can be uneven and preservation biased, but there is no serious reason to imagine Neanderthal life without it. The maintenance of such a life requires labour that leaves only faint traces. Fuel must be found and carried, which in cold or sparsely wooded landscapes is no minor task. Wood suitable for burning is not always abundant near camp. Branches, brush, perhaps dried dung in some environments all may matter. Hides need scraping and softening. Stone needs knapping into edges sharp enough for butchery and working other materials. Bones may be cracked for marrow, tendons may be stripped and dried for binding. Water must be brought from streams or springs that may freeze or flood depending on season. These are not glamorous activities, but the archaeological record rarely preserves what is glamorous anyway. It preserves residues of process. flint flakes beside animal bones, polish on tool edges from repeated use, burned fragments in concentrations that suggest repeated cooking or heating. From such fragments, a domestic rhythm begins to emerge. Food anchors much of that rhythm. Large game often dominates the conversation because it leaves the most visible remains, and because Neanderthals are clearly formidable hunters, but a meal is never just a dramatic kill on an open plain. It is also the long after work of disassembly, transport, preservation, sharing, and consumption. Butchery marks on animal bones show practiced hands separating flesh-skinning carcasses, disarticulating limbs, extracting marrow, and perhaps rendering grease when times are hard. The degree of planning involved can be considerable. A large animal cannot always be carried whole. Decisions must be made quickly about which parts to take, first what to leave behind, and how to protect the most valuable cuts from scavengers. In some cases, carcasses are clearly processed at the kill site before selected portions are brought back to camp. That suggests coordination, not mere opportunism. The diet itself is more varied than the oldest stereotype allowed. Meat likely provides a major share of calories in many settings, especially in colder regions where large herbivores are crucial resources. But what survives in the record suggests additional layers. Plant foods may be cooked and eaten when available. Dental calculus has yielded traces that hint at starches and other plant material. In certain coastal or riverine contexts, marine foods or freshwater resources may play a role. Mushrooms, nuts, seeds, roots, and seasonal fruits do not preserve easily, yet their absence in the archaeological record is not proof of irrelevance. One lesser-known detail is that microscopic residues trapped in ancient teeth can sometimes imply not just what was eaten, but aspects of habitat and even medicinal plant use, though such interpretations must be handled cautiously. No single explanation fully accounts for every regional diet, and variation is exactly what one would expect from people spread across diverse environments. Injuries add another intimate layer to the picture. Neanderthal bodies often show damage, some of it dramatic. A broken rib heals crookedly. A fracture knits. Teeth wear down from work and age. Joints show strain. This is the physical record of a hard life, but not simply of violence. It is also a record of persistence. An injury that heals implies time and often support. A person unable to hunt or travel normally for weeks or months does not remain alive without a group capable of absorbing that burden. Care is not an optional extra in small Ice Age communities. It is one of the technologies of survival as necessary in its own way as fire or sharp stone. What survives in the record suggests that Neanderthal groups possess this capacity repeatedly, though the emotional language modern people might wish to apply to it remains beyond direct recovery. Children too reshape the meaning of a camp. Prehistoric sites are often discussed in terms of adults because adult bones, tools and prey dominate the evidence, but a human group is never only its hunters. Infants must be carried. Young children must be kept from fire, from cliff edges, from deep water, from tools sharp enough to injure, and predators patient enough to wait. Adolescents must learn how to contribute before they are fully grown. In a landscape where mistakes can be fatal, the raising of children becomes a continuous exercise in teaching. Skills must be shown and repeated. The gestures of tool-making, the discipline of staying quiet during a hunt, the recognition of edible and inedible plants, the memory of when a river crossing is safe and when it becomes a trap. All of this must pass from older bodies to younger ones. The exact richness of Neanderthal language remains debated, but the daily realities of their world strongly imply systems of communication more than adequate for complex instruction. Shelter itself may vary enormously. In a cave, the back may offer darkness and relative safety, though also damp smoke accumulation and competition with other animals. Near the entrance there is light, but also exposure. Open camps require judgment about wind direction, drainage visibility, and access to resources. A poor camp location can become deadly after a sudden change in weather. A good one can mean warmth, defensibility, and shorter trips to water or game trails. Archaeologists sometimes find repeated occupations of particular sites over long periods, suggesting that some locations remain valuable generation after generation. This repeated return is revealing. It implies memory not only within individual lives but across communities. The landscape is known. Certain ridges, caves, and river bends belong to a map carried in minds long before any map is drawn. The sensory world of such places is easier to imagine than their exact beliefs. Smoke clings to skin, hair, and hide. Fat crackles over flame. Stone clicks under practiced blows. Outside the shelter, the wind may carry scents of wet earth, snow animal musk, or distant carrion. In darkness, hearing matters. The cough of a predator, the shifting of hoofed animals, the cracking of ice, the warning tone in another person's breath. Little of this survives directly, and yet all of it forms the lived environment in which Neanderthals make decisions. To reconstruct their lives only through skull measurements or tool typologies is to miss something essential. They inhabit a tactile, noisy, dangerous, and deeply practical world where intelligence is not abstract but immediate, and still within that immediacy there is room for continuity. Fires are built the way they have been built before. Raw materials are selected according to remembered standards. Butchery follows techniques that work. Children absorb habits from adults. Injured people survive because others know how to keep them alive. These are the threads of a durable culture, even if it leaves no monuments behind. What makes Neanderthal life so compelling is that it is neither alien in the absolute sense nor comfortably identical to our own. It is recognizable in its domestic pressures and yet shaped by an environmental severity modern people rarely have to face directly. The result is a form of humanity that feels close enough to touch and distant enough to remain partly shadowed. That shadow matters because it reminds us how much is lost. The cave preserves charcoal, not conversation. The ground preserves footprints only by accident. The bones reveal healed injuries, but not the tone of the hands that dressed them. All the same, enough remains to see a people not merely surviving in a dramatic abstract sense, but living through the constant ordinary work by which any human life is made possible. Firelight, shelter, food, teaching, repair, endurance. These are the real foundations of their world. And once that world is seen at close range, the later disappearance becomes more unsettling. A people with camps, habits, and generations behind them are not lightly erased. Something will have to happen not only to their species but to this intimate structure of daily survival that has held together for an astonishing span of time. For most of their long history, Neanderthals do not live in a world shared with us. They live in a world shared with weather prey, predators, changing forests, open steppe, and the familiar pressures of their own existence. Their rivals are often hunger, injury, cold, and distance. Then gradually and unevenly, another human population begins to move outward from Africa and into the lands Neanderthals already know. This is not a single march or one decisive crossing. It is a long expansion broken by pauses, false starts, local disappearances, and renewed movements across thousands of years. But the larger result is unmistakable. Homo sapiens enters Western Asia and eventually Europe, and for the first time in prehistory, two closely related human species begin to occupy the same wider world. That overlap is one of the most consequential meetings in human history, and one of the least directly visible. There is no written record, no witness account, no surviving tradition that can be trusted as memory of first contact. The event leaves behind only indirect clues, layers in caves, shifts in tool traditions, changing animal use dates from bones and charcoal fragments of DNA, and the stubborn chronology showing that the two populations coexist in parts of Eurasia for thousands of years. Scholars still debate the exact tempo and regional pattern of this overlap because the evidence remains incomplete, and dating in prehistory is rarely as neat as popular narratives would prefer. Even so, the broad picture holds. There is a time when the campfires of Neanderthals and the campfires of early modern humans burn within reach of the same landscapes. The first movements of Homo sapiens beyond Africa are older than the final successful expansion into Europe. There are earlier dispersals into the Near East, and perhaps elsewhere that do not always lead to lasting population continuity. Human movement in the late Pleistocene is not one clean wave. It resembles advanced retreat replacement and persistence in a patchwork. That complexity matters because it means contact with Neanderthals may begin before the final scenes usually emphasized in popular history. The Levant, with its strategic position between Africa and Eurasia, likely serves again and again as a zone of passage encounter and overlap. Caves in this region preserve alternating or nearby traces of both Neanderthals and modern humans across long spans, suggesting that the same landscapes are occupied by different human groups at different times, and perhaps sometimes nearly at once. When Homo sapiens begins to establish a stronger and more lasting presence across Eurasia, roughly between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, the balance changes. These newcomers are not unknown to harsh conditions. They arrive with their own long evolutionary history, their own learned traditions, their own technologies, and above all their own social networks. Their bodies are generally built differently from Neanderthals, often leaner and less compact, reflecting different ancestral environments. Their tools in some regions show different preferences and methods. Their patterns of movement may also differ. None of this means that one species is simply superior in every respect. It means that two populations shaped by different histories now begin to interpret and compete within some of the same ecological space. It is tempting to imagine first contact as a dramatic single moment, two groups seeing one another across a valley in winter light, both recognizing at once that the other is nearly human and not quite the same. Something like that may well happen many times, but the record does not permit certainty, and reality is probably more varied and less theatrical. In some places, the first sign of another human group may be a track in mud, a distant fire scavenge remains at a carcass, a sudden absence of prey in a usually reliable hunting ground, or unfamiliar stone tools left where no one in the local group would have made them. Contact does not need a formal introduction. Sometimes it begins with signs of presence before bodies ever meet face to face. What would each group perceive in the other? The evidence cannot answer fully, but it allows careful inference. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are close enough biologically that the differences would not be absolute. They would both walk upright, use fire, carry tools, hunt, gather care for children, and move through the landscape with deliberate purpose. Yet they would not look identical. Neanderthals are generally more robust, broader, through the chest and shoulders with distinctive faces and skull shape. Early modern humans would likely appear taller or more graceful in many cases, with different facial proportions, different movement patterns, perhaps different clothing styles, ornaments or tools depending on the region. Even smell, voice, or habitual gestures may have marked the difference, though those things are lost to us. No single explanation fully accounts for how quickly either population would classify the other, but it is difficult to imagine that the distinction goes unnoticed for long. The overlap unfolds in landscapes already under pressure. climate fluctuations continue to reshape the late Pleistocene world. Animal herds shift. Some regions become more open, others more fragmented. Useful corridors expand and contract. Into this unstable setting comes a second human population capable of exploiting similar prey and shelter. That alone matters. Even without direct violence, the arrival of new hunters into a region can change everything. A valley that once supports one small population may struggle to sustain two. A migration route known to Neanderthals for generations may become less reliable if others are using it differently or more intensively. Competition need not look like war to have consequences. It can take the quieter form of pressure accumulating at the edges of survival. At the same time, the evidence suggests the encounter is not purely hostile. The strongest proof of that lies in genetics, though the full implications will become clearer later. Modern humans outside Africa carry inherited Neanderthal DNA, which means that contact between the two species includes interbreeding. That fact alone transforms the meeting from an abstract overlap into a biological intimacy. They do not simply share landscapes, at least sometimes they share kinship. The frequency, social context, and direction of such encounters remain debated, and scholars are cautious for good reason. A few episodes of interbreeding can leave a detectable legacy without implying seamless or peaceful integration on a large scale. Still, the old picture of total mutual avoidance cannot stand. The boundary between these human species is real, but it is also permeable. Archaeology hints at other kinds of contact, though interpretation becomes difficult here. In some places, tool traditions shift in ways that may suggest influence, imitation, parallel innovation, or population replacement. The Châtelperronian industry in Western Europe, for example, has long been debated as a possible sign of Neanderthals adopting or developing behaviors once associated more strongly with incoming Homo sapiens, including certain tool forms and perhaps ornament use. But scholars still debate exactly what such assemblages mean. Are they evidence of cultural borrowing, independent invention, mixed populations, or simply classification problems imposed by modern researchers? The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the very existence of such debates reveals how entangled the record becomes once the two populations overlap. Clean separation grows harder to maintain. There is also the matter of scale. Homo sapiens may possess one advantage that does not announce itself in a single spear point or skeleton: broader and more durable social networks. Small bands connected across longer distances can exchange mates' information and materials in ways that buffer local hardship. A group facing temporary scarcity may survive if it can lean on wider ties. A more isolated population may not. This does not mean Neanderthals lack social worlds of their own. Clearly they do. But what survives in the record suggests that modern humans in some regions may operate within larger networks of exchange and alliance. If so, then their arrival changes not just local encounters, but the demographic structure of entire landscapes. Two species can appear similar at the campfire scale, while differing significantly in how their populations absorb stress. One lesser known but deeply revealing clue comes from the timing itself. In several regions, Neanderthals do not vanish instantly when Homo sapiens arrives. There is overlap, sometimes prolonged overlap. That matters because it argues against the simplest version of conquest. If one species simply overwhelms the other immediately in every encounter, the chronology should look cleaner than it does. Instead, what survives in the record suggests something slower and more uneven. Some Neanderthal groups persist for millennia after modern humans enter neighbouring or even partly shared territories. That implies resilience, local adaptation, and perhaps complex regional dynamics, rather than one universal pattern. The meeting is not one event. It is a long process, and different valleys may experience it very differently. Still, however gradual, the significance of the encounter is hard to overstate. For the first time, Neanderthals face another human species whose ecological niche overlaps substantially with their own, whose populations may grow in more connected ways, and whose expansion continues rather than receding completely. This does not instantly destroy the Neanderthal world, but it changes its geometry. Boundaries that were once defined mainly by climate, prey and terrain now include another intelligent competitor, neighbour and occasional mate. The familiar map of survival begins to shift. That is what makes this meeting so haunting. It is not just the contact of two populations, it is the narrowing of a broader human world. For a while, both species are present, each carrying its own long inheritance into the same age. One has deep roots in Eurasia. The other is arriving from afar with its own strengths, its own mobility, and eventually its own staying power. Their lives overlap enough to leave marks in caves, in tools, and in genes. And from that overlap onward, the story of Neanderthals can no longer be told in isolation. Whatever happens next, whether through competition, mixing retreat disease, or some combination, no single explanation fully captures begins here, in the moment when one human world realizes that it is no longer alone in the landscape. Once the two populations begin to share the same broader world, the question becomes less whether they meet, and more what those meetings actually look like. This is where the story turns especially delicate, because the evidence is strongest for overlap and outcome, but weaker on the texture of individual encounters. Archaeology can show that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens occupy neighbouring regions, or even some of the same regions within roughly the same periods. Genetics can prove that at least some of those encounters become intimate enough to produce children. But between those points lies a wide range of possibilities: avoidance, brief contact, cautious, imitation, opportunistic exchange, territorial tension, violence, coexistence by distance, and moments of recognition that leave no visible trace at all. Scholars still debate how direct or frequent many of these encounters were, and the record is too fragmentary to allow any single neat scenario. It is entirely possible that in many places contact begins indirectly. One group arrives at a rock shelter and finds unfamiliar tool debris in old sediments, or scattered near the surface. A hunting route that once yielded dependable game now shows signs of another presence. Tracks cross in damp ground. A carcass has been processed by hands using different techniques. A source of good flint appears more heavily used than before. In a prehistoric landscape, awareness of rivals or neighbours may come first through signs rather than conversation. This matters because it means the emotional reality of contact may begin long before bodies stand face to face. Suspicion, caution, curiosity and strategic adjustment can all take shape in the mind before any formal meeting occurs. Where meetings do happen directly, the possibilities are hard to reduce. Some encounters may be fleeting and tense. A hunting party glimpses another human group across open ground and withdraws rather than test the outcome. Some may be hostile, especially where resources are tight and familiarity is low. In small-scale foraging worlds, strangers are not automatically welcomed. Distance from the group can mean danger, and another population exploiting similar prey may be understood as a threat even without overt aggression. Yet hostility cannot be the whole story because the evidence rules that out. The genomes of living people, and later the genomes recovered from ancient bones, show that the boundary between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is crossed. Whatever suspicion exists, it is not absolute. That genetic fact has important consequences for how the overlap must be imagined. It means the two human groups are not simply rivals in adjacent ecological niches. At least sometimes they form relationships close enough to bring bodies' kinship and inheritance together. These episodes may be rare relative to the total number of encounters. They may be shaped by unequal power, in some cases mutual curiosity in others, and social conditions we can no longer reconstruct clearly. The evidence remains incomplete, and modern assumptions about romance consent and social identity cannot simply be projected backward without caution. But the larger point stands. The old habit of imagining separate human species as sealed worlds collapses here. Contact is personal as well as demographic. There may also be forms of exchange that fall short of interbreeding yet still matter greatly. Technology is one candidate. In some archaeological assemblages from Western Europe, the boundaries between Neanderthal-associated and sapiens-associated behaviours become blurred enough to provoke long arguments. Certain tool types, ornaments, or production styles appear in contexts linked to late Neanderthals, prompting debate over whether these represent borrowing, imitation, parallel invention, or population mixing. The shuttle Peronian remains the most famous example, though it is also one of the most disputed. Some researchers see it as evidence that Neanderthal respond creatively to the presence of Homo sapiens adopting or adapting certain new practices. Others argue that the dating association or interpretation is less secure than often claimed. No single explanation fully accounts for all such sites, but the broader implication is difficult to ignore. The encounter changes behaviour, or at least changes the archaeological pattern enough that rigid separation becomes unstable. Objects can move between groups even when people mistrust one another. A tool form can be copied after observation. A source of pigment can become newly valued. A successful way of hafting a point can spread without anyone ever considering the transfer a cultural exchange in the modern sense. The prehistoric world does not need marketplaces or diplomacy for influence to occur. It needs visibility, memory, and practical advantage. If one population sees that another is doing something useful, imitation may follow openly or unconsciously. At the same time, similar pressures can produce similar solutions independently, and archaeologists must always wrestle with that possibility. The line between influence and convergence is not easy to draw when all that remains are fragments of stone, bone, and sediment. Territory sharpens the problem. Neanderthals have deep familiarity with many Eurasian landscapes, but familiarity does not guarantee security. Homo sapiens may arrive with broader exchange networks, different mobility patterns, and perhaps higher reproductive resilience in some regions. If so, their presence need not lead to constant conflict to have cumulative effects. A landscape only supports so many people at a given technological level and under a given climate regime. If two human populations rely on overlapping resources, even modest demographic pressure can matter. One group may begin to avoid certain valleys. Another may reach prime hunting grounds earlier in the season. Preferred shelter sites may become contested or less predictable. What looks from a modern distance like coexistence may at ground level feel like a gradual squeezing of options, and yet coexistence of a sort does occur. The chronology of several regions suggests that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens overlap for thousands of years rather than moments. That is long enough for more than simple collision. It implies a patchwork in which some Neanderthal groups continue largely in their accustomed ways, while others encounter the newcomers more directly. Some places may experience repeated contact. Others may remain peripheral, insulated by terrain or distance for generations. This unevenness is important. It prevents the story from hardening into a single grand event. The meeting of the two human worlds is not one frontier line moving steadily west or north. It is a mosaic of local experiences, some brief, some prolonged, some perhaps barely visible except in hindsight. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence for this complexity does not come from Neanderthals and sapiens directly, but from another human lineage entirely. In Denisova Cave, a young girl is identified through ancient DNA as the daughter of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. That single fact is astonishing enough on its own, because it proves that different human lineages do not merely brush past one another in prehistory, they form families. More importantly for this part of the story, it warns against assuming that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are unique in crossing such boundaries. The late Pleistocene human world appears to be more interactive, more entangled and more biologically permeable than earlier generations imagined. Species labels remain useful, but life does not always obey the clarity of labels. There is also a psychological dimension that archaeology can only hint at. Another human species is not merely another predator or rival band, it is something stranger. Similar enough to provoke recognition, different enough to resist easy categorization. Did Neanderthals interpret Homo sapiens as an unfamiliar neighboring people, as distorted reflections of themselves, or as something else entirely? Did sapiens respond with fear, fascination, contempt, indifference, desire, or a shifting mixture of all five, depending on circumstance? The record offers no direct answers. What survives in the record suggests sustained overlap, occasional mixing and eventual replacement or absorption, but the emotional content of those encounters has mostly dissolved. That absence is part of what gives the subject its peculiar power. We're left with evidence of proximity and consequence, but almost none of the words or gestures that once filled the space between. Even silence, though, has a structure. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are merely passing strangers, their shared traces should be rarer than they are. If they are seamlessly merging populations, the distinctions between them should disappear more quickly than they do. Instead, the pattern points towards something in between, enough contact for genes and perhaps practices, to move enough separation for biological and cultural differences to remain visible for a long time, enough competition for one species to begin losing ground, yet not so much constant violence that the process resolves at once. Scholars still debate the proportions of these elements, but the middle ground is probably where much of reality sits. By now, the shape of the story has changed. Neanderthals are no longer simply surviving in their own ecological theatre. They are adjusting to a new human presence that is neither wholly enemy nor wholly kin, but some unstable combination of the two. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, are not entering an empty continent waiting to be humanized. They are moving into a world already known, used, and inhabited by another capable population. Each side becomes part of the other's environment. That alone is enough to alter decisions, routes, risks, and futures. This is why the overlap matters so much. It is not merely an interesting episode before the real story of disappearance begins. It is the place where the terms of survival start to shift. Neanderthals do not vanish the moment Homo sapiens appears, but after this point the old equilibrium cannot be taken for granted. Contact introduces new variables into an already unstable Ice Age world. It creates opportunities for exchange and kinship, but also pressures that accumulate quietly over generations. The result is not yet extinction. It is something subtler and in some ways more ominous, a human world, becoming crowded in a new way where every decision about movement, hunting, shelter, and alliance now unfolds in the presence of another kind of people, who are close enough to share blood and different enough to reshape the landscape simply by being there. The most intimate evidence of all does not come from a cave wall, a hunting site, or a buried hearth. It comes from living bodies. For most of modern history, extinction means disappearance in the absolute sense. A people vanish, and what remains are only ruins, bones, and speculation. Neanderthals complicate that idea in a way few vanished human groups ever could. They do disappear as a visible population. Their camps go cold, their tool traditions end, their bones stop appearing in younger layers except as the dead of an older world, and yet they do not vanish entirely because parts of them continue forward inside the species that survives. The clue is hidden in our blood, or more precisely in the genome carried in the cells of living people across much of the world. It is one of the strangest endings in prehistory. Another human species is gone, but not gone cleanly. The full meaning of that only becomes visible with the rise of ancient DNA research. Before genetics scholars can suspect contact between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but they cannot prove its biological consequences directly. The fossils suggest proximity. The archaeology suggests overlap. But the scale and reality of interbreeding remain open to argument. Then the molecular evidence begins to arrive, and with it one of the most important revisions in our understanding of human origins. People living today outside Africa carry a small but detectable percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. It is not large in any one individual, yet across whole populations it is unmistakable. That means the meeting of these two human species does not end at the boundary of observation or competition. It continues into reproduction, inheritance, and the deep afterlife of genes. The discovery matters because it overturns an older, comfortingly clean picture. There is no sharp wall separating modern humans from Neanderthals in the way earlier generations often assumed. The two lineages diverge deep in the past, but they remain biologically compatible enough that children can result from at least some unions. Those children or later descendants from similar encounters become part of the expanding Homo sapiens populations moving through Eurasia. Over time, as Neanderthals decline and sapiens persist, fragments of Neanderthal ancestry are carried onward in a new demographic setting. In that sense, some Neanderthals do not simply die out. They are absorbed partially and unevenly into the larger surviving human story. That is not the same as saying Neanderthals survive as a distinct people. They do not. Their disappearance as their own population remains real and profound. But genetics forces a more complicated language than simple replacement. The old idea that Homo sapiens arrives, eliminates Neanderthals, and leaves no trace of them beyond fossils proves too crude. The truth is messier. Some Neanderthals leave descendants within modern human lineages, even as Neanderthal communities themselves contract and disappear. Extinction here is intertwined with mixture. Scholars still debate the timing number and regional pattern of these interbreeding events, because the evidence remains incomplete, and new ancient genomes keep refining the picture. But the essential fact no longer moves. The boundary is crossed. One of the most striking details is that this inherited ancestry is not distributed evenly across all living humans. People with ancestry outside Africa generally carry more Neanderthal DNA than many populations whose deep history remains entirely or mostly within Africa, though even this broad statement needs care because later movements and back migrations complicate the map. The pattern fits with the idea that major episodes of interbreeding occur after Homo sapiens leave Africa and encounter Neanderthals in Western Asia or nearby regions. As those sapiens populations spread and diversify, they carry fragments of that ancestry with them. The result is that modern bodies walking through cities, airports, farms, and coastlines, thousands of years later still preserve tiny molecular memories of prehistoric contact. Those memories are not merely decorative. Some inherited Neanderthal variants may have influenced traits related to skin hair immune response metabolism and adaptation to non-African environments, though this area is complex and often oversimplified in popular accounts. Not every piece of Neanderthal ancestry is beneficial. Some may be neutral, some may be harmful in certain contexts. In fact, one revealing feature of the genome is that Neanderthal DNA is absent or reduced in particular regions, suggesting that natural selection removes some inherited variants over time because they are disadvantageous in Homo sapiens populations. That detail matters because it shows that interbreeding is not seamless blending. It is an evolutionary negotiation. Some fragments persist, others are gradually stripped away. This makes the genetic record feel strangely human in a deeper sense. Encounters happen. Children are born, descendants live, generations pass. Meanwhile, populations move, shrink, expand, and disappear. What remains in the genome is not a full portrait of the past, but a residue of these events shaped again afterward by selection, drift, and chance. No single explanation fully accounts for every pattern, because the prehistoric demographic story is too complex for that. There may be multiple episodes of admixture in different places and times. There may be asymmetries in which lineages contribute more often to later populations. There may be ancient encounters whose traces survive more faintly than current methods can detect. Genetics is powerful, but it is not omniscient. It recovers a map of inheritance, not a full emotional or social history, and yet even that partial map changes the meaning of Neanderthal disappearance. If a species vanishes but leaves genes behind in the one that remains, then the ending is neither pure extinction nor survival in any ordinary sense. It is something more haunting. Neanderthals become a ghost lineage within us, not as metaphor but as biology. That phrase can be abused if it is made too mystical. There is nothing supernatural about ancient admixture. But there is something undeniably unsettling in the realization that the surviving human species is not entirely self-contained. The people who once seemed to stand outside our story are in fact part of it at the deepest physical level. Their afterlife is written not in monuments but in chromosomes. One lesser known and especially revealing aspect of this story is that the interbreeding is not unique to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Other human lineages do it as well. Denisovans contribute ancestry to some modern populations, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania. The famous Denisova cave individual, whose parents belong to different lineages, shows that Neanderthals and Denisovans also mix directly. The late Pleistocene human world begins to look less like a set of sealed species and more like a patchwork of neighbouring populations, with boundaries that are real but permeable. Species labels remain useful because they reflect genuine evolutionary divergence, but reality on the ground appears more braided. Human difference in prehistory is significant yet not always absolute. This complicates modern identity in ways that can invite misuse, so caution matters. Neanderthal ancestry does not divide living people into purer or less pure humans. It does not justify fantasies of ranking intelligence, behaviour, or worth. Popular culture has repeatedly mishandled this subject, turning a subtle evolutionary history into caricature or pseudoscientific mythology. The mainstream scientific understanding is both more modest and more interesting. Neanderthal DNA is one part of a complicated inherited past shared unevenly, but broadly among many living populations. It tells us about contact movement, adaptation, and survival. It does not create a hierarchy of humanity. If anything, it undermines the old arrogance that imagined Homo sapiens as a perfectly separate and self-sufficient triumph. It also raises harder questions about the last Neanderthals themselves. If some of them leave descendants within sapiens populations, then the line between disappearance and absorption becomes difficult to draw sharply. A small, isolated Neanderthal group might not survive as a separate community for long, especially if pressured by climate and low numbers, but some of its members might still become ancestors within a neighbouring sapiens network. In that case, when exactly does extinction occur? When the last culturally Neanderthal community disappears, when the last person with mostly Neanderthal ancestry dies, when the last identifiable Neanderthal social world dissolves into a mixed population. Scholars still debate how best to frame that problem because extinction in human lineages is not always as neat as the vanishing of a species with no interbreeding at all. For the larger story, however, the implications are clear. By the time Neanderthals begin their final retreat, they are no longer only an external rival or neighbour to Homo sapiens. They are already in some measure part of the genetic future of the people who remain. That does not save their world. Their camps do not continue. Their traditions are not preserved whole. Their territories do not remain theirs. But they do leave something more intimate than tools and bones. They leave inherited fragments that move silently across millennia into descendants who will never know the names, faces, or landscapes from which those fragments came. That makes the old image of total disappearance feel inadequate. Neanderthals are vanishing, yes, but they are also entering the surviving human line in ways invisible to anyone alive at the time. The same valleys that witness competition and retreat also witness mixture. The same human world that is becoming narrower in one sense is becoming more entangled in another. And that entanglement matters because it means the story ahead will not be about a clean replacement of one human species by another. It will be about a slower and more complicated unravelling, in which some Neanderthal communities are absorbed at the edges, even as the larger Neanderthal presence across Eurasia begins to weaken. Their blood does not preserve their world, but it prevents their ending from being absolute. Even without the arrival of Homo sapiens, the Neanderthal world is never stable for long. It only appears solid in retrospect because we compress so much time into a few broad labels: Ice Age, Glacial Europe, Pleistocene Eurasia. In reality, these landscapes pulse and shift with unnerving force. Cold deepens, then eases. Forests spread into one region and retreat from another. Grasslands open, then fragment. Rivers alter their courses. Coastlines move far outward when sea levels fall, then drown again when warmth returns. Herd animals respond to these changes, and human beings have no choice but to respond with them. The land that sustains a group for generations can become less reliable, within a span short enough to be remembered by the old. By the time Neanderthals enter the last part of their history, this environmental instability is no distant backdrop. It is one of the main pressures tightening around them. The late Pleistocene climate does not simply become colder in one steady line. That would almost be easier to survive because a constant hardship can at least be understood and adapted to. Instead, the period is marked by abrupt fluctuations, sometimes dramatic ones in which warming and cooling episodes can rearrange habitats faster than a small human population can comfortably absorb. Scholars still debate the exact local consequences in many regions because the evidence remains incomplete and climate effects vary from valley to valley, but the broader pattern is clear. Neanderthals do not inhabit a single frozen world. They inhabit a restless one. Ecological zones are repeatedly broken apart and reassembled. This matters because Neanderthal life appears strongly tied to intimate local knowledge. Their success depends on reading the land well, knowing where prey tends to move, where shelter can be found, where stone is worth collecting, where winter becomes dangerous first, where water remains accessible, where a valley opens into useful hunting ground, and where it traps cold air and hunger. Such knowledge is powerful, but it is built on patterns. When the patterns become less dependable, the knowledge does not become useless, but it becomes harder to trust. A migration route used for generations may suddenly produce less game. A familiar refuge may become isolated. A mixed landscape of woodland and open ground may tip too far in one direction, reducing the variety of resources available. In a world of small, scattered populations, that kind of ecological disruption can become a demographic threat very quickly. Animal life tells part of the story. Many of the large herbivores Neanderthals rely on are themselves sensitive to climatic and vegetational change. Reindeer, horse bison, red deer, and other prey do not remain evenly distributed across the continent. Their numbers and routes shift with season and environment. Some regions may briefly become rich hunting grounds and then decline. Others may turn into corridors that are useful only intermittently. A hunting strategy built around large-bodied prey can work brilliantly when herds are predictable and landscapes remain open enough to exploit them. It becomes more fragile when those conditions begin to break apart. What survives in the record suggests that Neanderthals do adapt regionally and are not helpless in the face of change, but no single explanation fully accounts for how repeated ecological shocks would affect small populations already living near the margin. One lesser-known but important point is that climate stress does not only reduce food, it can also reduce connection. When habitats fragment, populations fragment with them. A broad zone once supporting multiple interacting groups may become a patchwork of isolated refugees separated by terrain, bad weather, unsuitable vegetation, or simple distance. That isolation matters enormously. Small populations are always vulnerable to losing members, losing knowledge, and losing reproductive resilience. If neighbouring groups become harder to reach, then a bad season is no longer just a bad season. It becomes a test of whether enough people remain afterward to keep the social world intact. In this way, climate acts not as a theatrical destroyer but as a quiet divider breaking continuity into pieces. Southern Europe and parts of Western Asia may at times function as refuges milder than the harsher north, and therefore more capable of supporting remnant Neanderthal populations when colder phases intensify. But refuge is a relative term. It does not mean comfort or safety. It means survival for longer than elsewhere, often in landscapes that may also be more crowded, more contested, or more ecologically constrained. When habitable zones shrink, populations are pushed together or cut off in awkward combinations. A region that once felt spacious becomes narrow. Resources that once rotated seasonally become more heavily used. The same cave valley mouth or river crossing may matter more than before because there are fewer alternatives. There is also the issue of timing. Environmental instability grows more dangerous when it coincides with other pressures. A Neanderthal population facing only climate might shift range, adapt locally, or persist in refugia as it has done many times before. A population facing only competition from Homo sapiens might perhaps still hold ground in familiar territories, but a population facing both at once enters a different kind of danger. A disrupted prey base, a fragmented habitat, and a second human species moving through the same broader ecosystems create a cumulative burden. Each pressure amplifies the others. Reduced resources make competition sharper. Competition makes retreat more costly. Retreat increases fragmentation. Fragmentation weakens recovery after environmental shocks. The archaeological record begins to hint at this tightening indirectly. In some later periods, Neanderthal sites appear more patchy, more regionally confined and less securely continuous than before. Interpreting absence is always difficult, because people can fail to appear in the record for reasons of preservation alone, but the overall pattern suggests contraction rather than confidence. Their world is not ending everywhere at once. It is becoming less connected, less predictable, and less forgiving. Scholars still debate how sharply these changes unfold in each region, but few now doubt that climatic instability is part of the story, and there is a cruel irony in that. Neanderthals are in many ways masters of difficult environments. Their bodies' technologies and habits are shaped by long experience in Eurasia's demanding conditions. Yet specialization can carry a hidden cost. A people highly tuned to one broad style of life may be exceptionally strong within it, and less resilient when the rules begin changing too quickly. This does not mean Neanderthals are rigid or incapable of adjustment. The evidence argues against such a simple conclusion, but it does suggest that the world they know best is becoming harder to read, at exactly the moment when new human competitors are spreading into it. So the pressure builds not as a single catastrophe, but as a narrowing of margins. Winters bite harder in some places, routes fail, herds shift, local populations lose contact, useful landscapes shrink into separated pockets. Familiar knowledge still matters perhaps more than ever, but it must now operate inside a world whose stability is breaking down. The fire still burns, the hunt still goes on, the children still learn the old terrain, yet the terrain itself is no longer keeping its side of the bargain. This is how extinctions often begin in human history, and before it not with one dramatic ending, but with a long change in conditions that turn survival from difficult into fragile. By the time the last Neanderthal communities face their final centuries, the Ice Age is no longer just the world they inhabit. It is becoming one of the forces quietly closing around them. By the time the pressure of climate fragmentation and overlap with Homo sapiens begins to converge, the Neanderthal story stops looking like a mystery with one clean answer and starts looking like something more human and more tragic. Populations do not usually disappear because of a single flaw waiting to be exposed. They fade when several disadvantages begin reinforcing one another. A group that can survive cold may still struggle against isolation. A people well adapted to hunting large game may still falter if those prey become less predictable. A lineage capable of care memory and technical skill may still lose ground if its numbers are too low to absorb repeated losses. What survives in the record suggests that Neanderthals begin to fade not because they suddenly become incapable, but because the world around them becomes less forgiving at the same time that another human population proves better buffered against instability. One of the strongest explanations centers on numbers. Demography is rarely dramatic in storytelling terms, but in real history it is merciless. A small population can endure for a long time if conditions remain broadly stable and neighbouring groups remain accessible. But once numbers fall too low, danger changes its character. A harsh winter, a failed hunt, an outbreak of disease, a death in childbirth, an injury to a skilled hunter, the loss of a few children in one bad season. Any of these can matter more than they would in a larger and more connected population. Small groups are resilient in some ways, especially when they know their landscapes well, but they are also brittle. They have fewer spare adults, fewer mating options, fewer chances to recover from local disaster. Scholars still debate the exact size of late Neanderthal populations, but many lines of evidence suggest they are sparse scattered, and in some regions perhaps already thinning before their final disappearance. That thinning matters because Homo sapiens may enter the same broader landscapes with a different demographic structure. Even without assuming superior intelligence or some crude notion of inherent fitness, a population connected across longer distances can simply absorb shocks better. If one local group suffers losses, others may still provide mates knowledge and indirect support through wider networks of exchange. If one valley becomes unreliable, movement into another may be more feasible when social ties stretch farther. This kind of resilience does not always leave spectacular archaeological traces, but it may be one of the great hidden advantages of our species. Neanderthals do not need to be weaker in every direct sense for Homo sapiens to gain ground. They only need to be living in smaller, more isolated webs of survival. Tool traditions and subsistence strategies may also matter, though this is a subject where overstatement is common. For generations, popular accounts frame the issue too simply as if Homo sapiens arrives with better tools and therefore wins. The truth is subtler. Neanderthal technology is clearly effective and often sophisticated. They are not defeated because they lack competence. But what survives in the record suggests that modern human populations in some regions may use more varied toolkits, more extensive symbolic signaling, broader raw material networks, and perhaps a wider dietary range. None of these traits alone would guarantee success. Together, however, they may provide flexibility. In unstable conditions, flexibility is often more important than optimization. A people highly specialized for one successful way of life may be at a disadvantage against a people able to switch more readily between strategies, prey types, landscapes, and alliances. Diet offers one possible example. Neanderthals are clearly capable of varied subsistence, and the old picture of them as almost pure big-game hunters has been softened by later evidence. Even so, many Neanderthal populations appear heavily dependent on large herbivores. That dependence can work brilliantly when ecosystems support it. It becomes riskier when climate shifts, habitats fragment, and competition intensifies. Homo sapiens in some regions at least may have relied on a somewhat broader resource base, including fish birds, small game plant foods, and seasonal opportunism used more intensively or more often. Scholars still debate how sharp this contrast really is because preservation biases distort the picture, but the broader principle remains persuasive. In unstable environments, the population that can squeeze calories from more sources gains a quiet but significant advantage. Then there is mobility. Neanderthals know their landscapes intimately, but intimate local knowledge is not exactly the same as expansive connectivity. A small group can move well within its known range and still remain demographically isolated on a larger map. Homo sapiens may have maintained broader circuits of movement and exchange, allowing tools, raw materials, mates, and information to travel farther. This matters not only for survival in bad years, but for innovation itself. New techniques spread faster in larger connected systems. Social buffers matter. A group facing scarcity does not have to solve every problem alone, if knowledge or resources can flow from elsewhere. No single explanation fully accounts for the difference, and archaeologists must infer much of it indirectly. But the contrast in connectivity may be one of the key reasons one human species persists, while another begins to fade. Violence is harder to measure. It would be surprising if conflict played no role at all. Two closely related human populations using overlapping resources in harsh conditions are unlikely to coexist without at least local tension. Yet the evidence does not support a simple fantasy of constant warfare ending in rapid extermination. The overlap lasts too long, and the genetic record complicates any image of absolute hostility. If violence occurs, it probably does so unevenly in local episodes mixed with avoidance, exchange, and coexistence. In that sense, direct conflict may contribute to Neanderthal decline without serving as the whole explanation. A few killings here and there matter far more when a population is already small, fragmented, and under environmental stress. Even limited violence can have outsized effect when numbers are low. Disease may also have entered the picture, though here the evidence is especially difficult. When populations with separate evolutionary histories come into sustained contact, pathogens can move in damaging ways. Later human history provides many brutal examples of that. It is reasonable to suspect that disease could have affected Neanderthals once Homo sapiens populations expanded into their territories, but the prehistoric evidence is thin, and scholars remain cautious because disease is easy to propose and hard to prove. What can be said is that small isolated populations tend to be more vulnerable to shocks of any kind, including illness. If disease did play a role, it likely joined the same larger pattern rather than standing alone as the decisive answer. There is one more possibility that complicates the story further. Some Neanderthals may not have disappeared in the usual sense at all, but been gradually absorbed into expanding Homo sapiens populations through repeated interbreeding. That process would not preserve the Neanderthal world as a distinct culture or community, but it would blur the boundary between extinction and assimilation. A very small Neanderthal group on the edge of its old range might not survive long independently, yet some of its members could still become ancestors within sapiens networks. In that case, fading would mean not only dying out, but dissolving into a larger human population. This idea cannot explain everything because Neanderthal societies clearly do vanish as recognizably separate communities. Still, it helps explain why their end feels less like a single break and more like a long unraveling. What emerges from all of this is not a morality tale about one superior species replacing an inferior one. It is a harsher and more realistic picture. Neanderthals begin to fade because they are caught in a narrowing world. Their populations are small, their habitats are fragmenting, their prey is less predictable, their social networks may be less extensive. Another human species is entering the same ecological space with broader demographic resilience. Some contact is hostile, some intimate, some perhaps barely visible. Climate keeps pushing. Local losses accumulate. Recovery becomes harder. This is how disappearance often starts. Not with one final blow, but with the growing failure of old strengths to guarantee survival under new conditions. Neanderthals remain capable, intelligent, and deeply adapted to their world. The tragedy is that adaptation to one world is not always enough when that world itself is changing, and when survival now depends on more than knowing the land. It depends on numbers, flexibility, and connection. By the time that becomes clear, the fading has already begun. By this point, the temptation is to search for one decisive explanation, one final mechanism that can tidy the whole story into a clear ending. It is an understandable instinct. Human beings like causes with sharp edges. They like turning points that can be named, singled out, and placed under a heading. But the Neanderthal disappearance resists that kind of simplicity at almost every step. The evidence does not point toward one universal cause, operating everywhere in the same way. It points instead toward a drawn-out and uneven unraveling one that likely unfolds differently from region to region, century to century, and group to group. No single explanation fully accounts for this vanishing, because what is disappearing is not a machine with one broken part. It is a network of human communities stretched across shifting landscapes and exposed to several pressures at once. That unevenness matters. A Neanderthal group living in a relatively mild refuge in southern Iberia does not face the exact same conditions as a group farther east or north. One population may feel the effects of climate instability first through prey decline. Another may feel them through fragmentation and isolation. One may encounter Homo sapiens frequently. Another may meet them only occasionally, hearing of them at a distance before ever seeing them. One group may interbreed and be partly absorbed into expanding sapiens networks. Another may simply contract and disappear without leaving descendants that can be identified. Extinction in this context is not one moment. It is a mosaic of endings. That is why some of the oldest explanations, though still influential, now seem too blunt when taken alone. Climate change is real and clearly important, but Neanderthals have already survived major climatic swings before. Competition with Homo sapiens is also real and difficult to ignore, yet the chronology of overlap suggests that contact does not always lead to immediate disappearance. Interbreeding happens, but mixture alone does not preserve Neanderthal communities. Disease is plausible but difficult to prove directly. Small population size is compelling, yet numbers become fatal only within larger ecological and social contexts. Each explanation carries part of the weight. None comfortably carries all of it. This is one reason the story remains so alive in research. It is not merely that scientists enjoy argument, though they often do. It is that the evidence keeps forcing them back toward complexity. A new radiocarbon date may slightly shift the timing of a late site and reopen debate over how long Neanderthals survive in a particular refuge. A new genetic study may suggest lower population sizes, deeper isolation, or more varied episodes of interbreeding than once assumed. A new cave layer may complicate which tool tradition belongs to which group. The disappearance is not only ancient, it is difficult in the technical sense because almost every line of evidence arrives fragmented, unevenly preserved, and vulnerable to reinterpretation. One of the most revealing patterns is that late Neanderthal history often looks geographically patchy. Instead of a broad and confident occupation across their former range, the record suggests pockets, remnants, and refugees. This is exactly the sort of pattern one would expect from a population losing coherence. A species need not vanish everywhere at once to be in deep trouble. In fact, wide-ranging species often disappear by stages, with local extinctions chipping away at the whole until only isolated populations remain. Those remnant groups may survive for surprising lengths of time in marginal or protected zones, but survival in a refuge is not the same as long-term security. It can be the final phase of contraction rather than a sign of recovery. There is also a mathematical cruelty to small populations that does not need drama to be devastating. Once numbers fall low enough, random chance becomes more powerful. A run of poor winters, a few lost infants, one failed generation of reproduction, the death of a particularly knowledgeable adult, any of these can have effects out of proportion to their scale. Demographic fragility is not glamorous, but it is one of the most likely features of the late Neanderthal world. Genetic studies have suggested that some Neanderthal populations may have been quite small, and sometimes inbred, particularly in their later phases. Scholars still debate the exact interpretation of this evidence, because ancient genomes are few and not always representative. But what survives in the record suggests communities living close to the edge of demographic viability. Inbreeding itself likely matters here, though not in the simplistic or sensational way it is sometimes presented. Small isolated groups naturally have fewer mating options. Over time, that can increase the expression of harmful genetic variants, reduce resilience, and make recovery harder after losses. Yet inbreeding alone rarely explains everything. Plenty of animal and human populations can persist with low diversity for long periods under favourable conditions. The trouble comes when low diversity is combined with environmental stress, fragmentation, competition, and disease risk. Once again, the point is not that one factor destroys Neanderthals, but that several together make persistence harder with each passing generation. A similar caution applies to the idea of cognitive inferiority. For a long time, this is the hidden assumption behind many popular accounts. Homo sapiens survive because they are smarter, more creative, more symbolic, more fully human. Neanderthals vanish because they are less so. The problem with this story is not just that it flatters us. It is that the archaeological and genetic evidence no longer support such a clean hierarchy. Neanderthals are clearly capable of complex toolmaking, coordinated hunting care for the injured, adaptation to difficult environments, and at least some behaviors that point towards symbolic or socially rich lives. It is still possible that Homo sapiens on average, or in some context, operate with broader symbolic systems, denser exchange networks, or more cumulative innovation. But even if that is true, it would matter because of demographic and social effects, not because Neanderthals are somehow dull-witted caricatures waiting to be replaced. Another subtle but important possibility is that different causes dominate at different times. Early in the process, climate instability may fragment habitats and reduce local populations. Later, Homo sapiens expansion may make recovery harder by occupying the same ecological spaces and drawing away opportunities for refuge or exchange. In some regions, interbreeding may absorb individuals or small groups. In others, isolation may deepen without much contact at all. Disease, if it plays a role, may strike only after sustained overlap is already underway. This staged model is less elegant than a single cause explanation, but it fits the evidence better. The end of Neanderthals may not be one event so much as a chain of regional crises unfolding inside a broader continental pattern. There is a strange emotional consequence to this kind of extinction. A single catastrophe would at least have a dramatic clarity. A volcano, a flood, a conquest, a final massacre. But a piecemeal ending is quieter, and in some ways sadder. It means there is no universal last day. Some Neanderthal communities may scarcely understand that their world is narrowing beyond recovery. They simply move less far, find fewer neighbouring groups, lose a few more people, return to familiar shelters under worse conditions, and carry on until carrying on no longer works. The last generation in one valley may have no sense that elsewhere others like them have already disappeared. Deep prehistory allows for loneliness on that scale. This is why the disappearance remains partly mysterious, even though many of its ingredients are visible. The causes are not hidden because there is no evidence. They are difficult because the evidence points in several directions at once. Modern research has done something more valuable than providing a neat answer. It has shown why the neat answer was always unlikely. Neanderthals are not a failed experiment ending in a single mistake. They are a successful human lineage meeting a convergence of pressures under conditions that make recovery increasingly improbable. Their disappearance is therefore not simple. It is historical in the deeper sense, shaped by place-timing contingency and the cumulative weight of many small disadvantages becoming one irreversible trend. By the time the story reaches its final refuges, this complexity is no longer a puzzle to be solved later. It is the condition of the ending itself. Neanderthals do not vanish from one cause because their world is not one thing. It is many camps, many valleys, many family lines, many local strategies, many fragile recoveries. And as those pieces break apart, the larger human pluralism of the Pleistocene begins to collapse with them, not in a single blow, but in a long, uneven silence. By the time Neanderthals approach the end of their story, they are no longer spread broadly across the full range they once knew. The map has tightened. What was once a wide and durable human presence across much of Europe and Western Asia now appears to contract into pockets, edge zones, and difficult refuges where survival remains possible a little longer. This is the phase that draws historians and archaeologists towards certain caves with unusual intensity, because in those buried layers lies the hardest question of all: where and when do the last Neanderthals remain? The answer is less clear than popular retellings often suggest. There is no universally agreed final campfire. No single cave can be named with total confidence as the last place another human species holds out against time. Scholars still debate the dates, the associations, and even the identity of some of the people involved. But what survives in the record suggests a final geography of retreat. Southern Iberia has often stood near the centre of this debate. The rugged landscapes of what is now Spain and Gibraltar, with their caves, coastal zones, and relatively milder climates, have long seemed plausible refuges for late Neanderthal communities. If harsher northern environments become increasingly unstable or less productive, then the south offers a kind of narrowing shelter, not abundant or secure but survivable. Sites such as Gorham's Cave and nearby caves on the Rock of Gibraltar have therefore taken on an almost mythic status in public imagination. The idea is compelling. While Homo sapiens expand across Europe, a few remnant Neanderthal groups persist at the southwestern edge of the continent, hunting, gathering, tending fire, and watching a world shrink around them. It is a powerful image, but like many powerful images in prehistory, it rests on evidence that requires caution. Dating late Neanderthal sites is notoriously difficult. Radiocarbon methods become less secure as materials approach the edge of their reliable range. Contamination can distort results, and the relationship between a dated sample and the specific human population associated with it is not always as direct as one might hope. A piece of charcoal may not date the same event as a tooth nearby. A layer may be disturbed. Material may move downward or upward in ways invisible without careful analysis. This is why the identity of the last Neanderthals has shifted repeatedly as new dating methods refine or overturn older conclusions. Sites once thought to preserve very late Neanderthal survival have sometimes turned out to be older than expected. Others remain disputed. The evidence remains incomplete and the final chronology is still being adjusted. Even so, the broader shape of the ending still points toward refuges. Iberia likely matters. So do parts of southern France, Italy, the Balkans, and perhaps certain pockets farther east, depending on how future evidence develops. The last Neanderthals are unlikely to be a single isolated band in one cave and nowhere else. More plausibly, they survive in several separated populations, some of them barely connected, if connected at all, inhabiting the lingering edges of the former world. That separation is itself part of the tragedy. A refuge can preserve life for a time, but it can also become a trap. Isolation reduces mating options, weakens exchange, and turns any local failure into something much harder to repair. The same geography that shields a population from immediate replacement may also cut it off from recovery. Imagine one of those lake communities at the far edge of the Neanderthal world. The landscape is not necessarily apocalyptic. That is what makes the ending so haunting. There are still animals to hunt, still fuel to gather, still stone to work, still children learning the shape of coastlines, ravines, or wooded slopes. The fire still burns in the evening. The routines of butchery, repair, and watchfulness still structure the day. But something has changed at the scale of years and generations. The neighbouring groups are fewer. Old movement routes are riskier or no longer used. Certain valleys now belong more often to others. Encounters with Homo sapiens may be occasional or increasingly common depending on place, but either way, the wider human world is no longer one Neanderthals dominate. Their range has become patchy. Their future has become local. One lesser known but revealing point is that survival in refugia can create misleading impressions. A late site may look vibrant in its own narrow context with clear traces of hearths, food processing, tool-making, and repeated use. Yet that local activity does not mean the larger population is healthy. A final refuge can be culturally alive and demographically doomed at the same time. This is a pattern seen elsewhere in history and ecology. Communities often maintain normal rituals and routines long after the broader structures that sustain them have begun to fail. The final Neanderthals may not experience themselves as a people at the end of history. They may simply experience a world with fewer familiar faces, more unpredictable pressures, and a horizon that is growing smaller without announcing why. Gibraltar has drawn particular attention, partly because of evidence that late Neanderthals there may have exploited a broad range of coastal and terrestrial resources. Marine foods, birds, shellfish, and other flexible subsistence strategies have been proposed, which complicates the old assumption that Neanderthals are too rigid to adapt. If some of the last communities do indeed widen their resource use, that only sharpens the mystery. They are not simply passive victims unable to respond. They are still adjusting, still finding ways to live, still working with the possibilities available. No single explanation fully accounts for why such adjustments fail to preserve them in the long run. Adaptation continues, but within increasingly narrow demographic limits. It is also possible that the final disappearance is not simultaneous even within these refugee zones. One cave may be abandoned while another remains occupied for generations longer. One coastal pocket may lose its Neanderthal population through absorption into nearby Homo sapiens groups. Another may end through local demographic collapse, bad fortune, or a combination too subtle ever to recover. Extinction at this scale is likely staggered. The last Neanderthal is therefore not just unknown by name. He or she may be unknowable in principle because the ending is distributed across separate remnants of a broken world, rather than concentrated in one final scene. This uncertainty has encouraged some fringe ideas over the years, from fantasies of hidden survival into unexpectedly recent times to romanticized visions of secret refugees untouched for millennia. These do not hold up under mainstream evidence. There is no credible support for Neanderthals surviving into recorded history as isolated wild people haunting remote regions. The real story is more grounded and for that reason more compelling. Their disappearance happens in deep prehistory, but close enough to us that the timing still feels uncomfortably near. They are not swallowed by mythic antiquity. They are living in some places only tens of thousands of years before the first cities eventually appear. Their loss belongs to a world already recognizably human in many of its pressures and vulnerabilities. The final refugees therefore matter not because they offer a dramatic movie ending, but because they preserve the last visible fragments of a plural human world. In those caves and sheltered landscapes, the broader question becomes painfully concrete. What does it look like when an entire human species is reduced to scattered holdouts? It looks most likely very ordinary from inside. It looks like keeping the fire alive. It looks like watching weather. It looks like choosing whether to risk a hunt. It looks like caring for children in a world still full of immediate tasks. Extinction rarely announces itself to those living through its early stages. It is easier for later observers to see the pattern than for the people inside it to know that they are the last. And yet from our distance, the silence after them becomes impossible to ignore. The cave layers continue, but their characteristic tools disappear. Their bones cease to appear in younger deposits except as old remains. The signs of their distinct communities end. Homo sapiens continue. The broader human map simplifies. The refuges empty one by one until the places that once held another human presence now hold only traces. Ash, flint, bone, sediment, a tooth in the dark. The final Neanderthal world does not collapse with spectacle. It thins, retreats, and goes quiet. That is the mood of the last refugees, not a final battle, not a single catastrophe, but a narrowing of life into its last defensible corners. There for a while another human species endures with dignity, skill, and persistence. There in the shadowed edge of Eurasia, the old plural humanity makes its final stand not as legend, but as ordinary survival repeated until repetition is no longer enough. What remains after a people vanish is rarely the thing they valued most. Stone outlasts breath. Teeth outlast names. Fire survives as a stain in the earth long after its warmth is forgotten. For Neanderthals, this imbalance is especially severe. Their voices are gone entirely. Their gestures, jokes, fears, habits of affection, and ways of teaching children through tone and glance have all disappeared without record. What they leave behind instead is a scattered inventory of harder things worked, flint-cut-marked bone traces of hearths, the shape of skulls, residues in teeth, the chemistry of ancient diets, and perhaps most unexpectedly inherited fragments still carried in the bodies of many living people. From those remains, science has begun to recover not just the fact of their existence, but the contours of what they passed forward after they themselves were gone. The first legacy is practical and archaeological. Neanderthal sites preserve a record of competence that no longer depends on modern pity or caricature. Across Europe and Western Asia, their tools testify to repeated control over material and landscape. Their stoneworking traditions vary regionally and over time, which means they are not frozen in one static form of life. They respond to local conditions. They maintain learned practices. They make deliberate choices about raw materials, working edges, and hunting needs. Even after their extinction, those sites continue to shape how archaeologists think about intelligence, technology, and adaptation in deep prehistory. The old assumption that sophistication begins only with Homo sapiens has been damaged beyond repair. Neanderthals do not need to survive as a people to force a permanent correction in how the human past is understood. There is also the legacy of landscape use. Although prehistory rarely leaves behind obvious transformed environments, on the scale of agriculture or cities, repeated occupation still matters. A cave used generation after generation becomes layered with decisions where fires burn, where butchery happens, where stone is worked, where bodies rest. Hunting practices influence local prey populations in subtle ways. The transport of raw materials across distance reveals remembered routes and valued places. In a smaller, quieter register than later human societies, Neanderthals alter the spaces they inhabit through repeated presence. They make certain caves into persistent human places. They create pathways of return. Even where those pathways vanish physically, the archaeological record preserves their existence as patterned behavior rather than random wandering. One of the most important legacies lies in what Neanderthals force modern science to abandon. They destroy the comforting fiction of human singularity in the recent past. Before their rediscovery, it is easier to imagine humanity as one uninterrupted line culminating in the present. After them, that picture can no longer hold. The late prehistoric world becomes visibly plural. Homo sapiens are not alone at the top of some simple ladder. They are one surviving branch among several once living human lineages. That shift has consequences far beyond paleoanthropology. It changes the philosophical texture of human identity. It makes our present solitude look contingent rather than inevitable. Another human species lived beside our ancestors close enough in time to share landscapes, tools, genes, and perhaps learned behaviors. That fact cannot be put back into darkness once known. Genetics deepens that legacy into something more intimate. The Neanderthals do not leave monuments, but they leave ancestry. Small fragments of their DNA persist in many living populations, especially among people whose ancestors passed through Eurasia after Homo sapiens dispersed from Africa. These fragments are not a complete survival of Neanderthal identity, and they should never be romanticized into that. But they are real. They affect how the modern human story is written at the biological level. Some inherited variants appear to have influenced immune responses, skin traits, metabolism, and other features, though the picture is complex and still changing with new research. Some variants may have helped early modern humans adapt to unfamiliar non-African environments. Others appear to have been selected against over time. In either case, Neanderthal inheritance is not merely symbolic. It becomes part of the evolutionary fabric of the people who remain. That continuing biological trace has a strange emotional force because it breaks the usual boundary between extinct and extant. A mammoth is gone. A trilobite is gone. A vanished empire leaves ruins but no living bloodstream. Neanderthals, by contrast, survive partially in the descendants of those who outlast them. They are absent and present at once erased as a separate people, and yet still faintly active in the genes of living humans. No single explanation fully captures the meaning of that. It is not survival in the cultural sense. It is not extinction in the cleanest biological sense either. It is a partial persistence stripped of its original social world, carried forward inside another. There are also tantalizing hints that Neanderthal influence may have extended into the realm of behavior and adaptation more indirectly. If Homo sapiens entering Eurasia learn anything from watching or sharing space with Neanderthals, archaeology may struggle to prove it cleanly. Tool traditions can shift for many reasons. Similar solutions can emerge independently. Yet it would be surprising if two closely related human species overlapped for thousands of years in shared landscapes, without any observational influence at all. Scholars still debate the extent of cultural exchange, and the evidence remains incomplete, but even the debate itself is revealing. It acknowledges that Neanderthals are no longer seen as mute background figures waiting to disappear. They are active participants in a complex human world, capable of affecting others as well as being affected by them. One lesser known but important part of their legacy lies in methods rather than findings. Neanderthals have driven some of the most remarkable scientific advances in the study of the ancient past. Ancient DNA extraction, isotope analysis, microscopic wear studies, dental calculus research sediment, DNA improved radiocarbon dating, all have transformed our ability to recover lives once thought permanently unreadable. A cave no longer yields only bones and tools. It yields proteins, genetics, traces of diet, environmental clues, even indirect signals of human presence in sediment where no obvious skeleton survives. In this sense, Neanderthals continue to reshape modern knowledge by forcing science to become more subtle. They have turned prehistory from a largely anatomical field into one of molecular and ecological recovery as well. And yet for all this progress, a vast portion of their world remains out of reach. We can say more than before about what they ate, where they moved, how large some populations may have been, how they were related genetically, and how their bodies functioned in cold environments. But we still do not know the full structure of their languages if multiple languages existed among them, what myths or memories they may have carried, how they named places, or what emotional worlds gathered around their dead. The legacy they leave is therefore double. It is rich enough to overturn old arrogance, but incomplete enough to preserve mystery. The silence around them has narrowed, not disappeared. That incompleteness may itself be part of what they leave behind for us. Neanderthals remind the modern world that evidence has limits, and that humility is one of the few responsible postures toward deep time. Early generations are too quick to make them stupid because the record is thin. Later generations are sometimes tempted to make them fully modern in every trait because the record has grown richer. Both instincts flatten them into a reflection of present concerns. What survives in the record suggests something better and more difficult, a distinct human lineage close to us, in many ways different in others, and deserving to be understood on its own terms. By now their legacy reaches beyond science into culture. Neanderthals have become symbols in modern imagination, though often distorted ones. Their name is still sometimes used as an insult, a residue of old misunderstandings that science has long since outgrown. At the same time, popular fascination with them has grown because they offer a rare encounter with a humanity that is neither wholly alien nor comfortably familiar. They ask a question that reaches beyond fossils: what exactly counts as human when the past is crowded with neighbouring forms of intelligence, care, skill, and social life? That question does not end with archaeology. It lingers in ethics, philosophy, and the modern search for our own place in nature. So what they leave behind is larger than stone and bone. They leave a wound in the old story of human uniqueness. They leave inherited fragments in living genomes. They leave camps and caves that continue to yield new evidence. They leave a scientific revolution in how ancient life can be studied. They leave a challenge to pride because once another human species has been recognized as real, enduring and intimate to our story, the present can no longer pretend it was always meant to belong to us alone. And still the most haunting part of their legacy may be the simplest. They prove that another kind of human once stood in the world with enough strength, intelligence, and continuity to endure for hundreds of thousands of years, and that all of this can still end. Their tools remain. Their genes remain in part. Their presence remains in the record, but their separate fires do not return. The traces are there, and the people are gone. That imbalance is the shape of their afterlife. The deeper the evidence grows, the harder it becomes to keep the old definition of humanity intact. For a very long time, modern people prefer a comforting arrangement. There is us fully human, and behind us a procession of cruder forms, half-finished creatures edging toward the condition we now occupy alone. It is a flattering picture. It places Homo sapiens at the natural summit and turns every other branch of the human family into a rehearsal. Neanderthals have suffered especially from that habit of thought, reduced first to curiosities, then to brutes, then to a kind of useful contrast against which modern humans could appear more refined, more intelligent, more complete. But the actual record as it has accumulated over generations of excavation and scientific revision leaves that older arrangement in ruins. Neanderthals do not sit comfortably below us on a ladder. They stand beside us in a more crowded human past, and that changes the meaning of the word human itself. Part of that change comes from anatomy, but anatomy alone is not enough. Yes, Neanderthals are recognizably different in body shape, skull form, facial projection, and adaptation to cold climates. Those differences matter. They are not trivial. They reflect a long, separate evolutionary history and a successful way of inhabiting difficult landscapes. Yet difference in body no longer carries the old moral message. A broad chest, heavy brow, or differently proportioned limb is not evidence of lesser worth or a lesser claim to personhood. Once Neanderthals are understood as people who organize camps, care for the injured, make deliberate tools, survive brutal conditions, and at least sometimes bury their dead or mark their world in ways still debated, the old habit of equating different with primitive becomes harder to defend. The second part of the change comes from genetics, which has perhaps done more than any other field to break the illusion of modern human separateness. If Neanderthals were simply another animal distantly related and fundamentally outside our own condition, then their extinction would be sad in the way all extinctions are sad but not intimate. Ancient DNA destroys that distance. The fact that many living people carry inherited Neanderthal ancestry means the boundary between their world and ours is not as clean as modern instinct once required. They are not merely an interesting neighbouring species in the abstract. They are among our ancestors, though not in a simple or universal way. Their presence survives in us unevenly, partially, and without preserving their societies, but it survives nonetheless. That makes human identity less pure, less isolated, and therefore more real. There is also a subtler intellectual shift beneath this. Neanderthals force the abandonment of a triumphalist story in which success is always evidence of superiority. Homo sapiens survive. Neanderthals do not. It is tempting to read that outcome backward as proof that we are simply better. But extinction rarely works like a clean exam score. A lineage can be intelligent, resilient, and successful over enormous spans of time, and still disappear under converging pressures. Survival is partly merit, yes, but also contingency, demography, ecology, timing, luck, and inherited structure. What survives in the record suggests that Neanderthals are not fools overtaken by genius. They are a powerful human lineage caught inside changing climates, shrinking population networks, and the spread of another closely related species whose social and demographic flexibility may in the end have mattered more than any simple hierarchy of intelligence. That recognition has consequences far beyond paleoanthropology. It forces a more humble understanding of what our own existence represents. If the human past includes multiple lineages capable of tool-making, care adaptation, and perhaps symbolic behavior, then humanity is not defined by one narrow checklist possessed only by us. It is a broader condition once expressed in different forms. Homo sapiens are not the sole owners of every trait that matters. We are the survivors of a broader experiment in being human. The present therefore looks less like destiny and more like the outcome of a thinning process whose alternatives have disappeared. Scholars have been pushed toward this humbler view not only by Neanderthals but also by Denisovans and other fragmentary or disputed populations that continue to emerge from the record. The more the prehistoric world fills with neighbouring human lineages, the less plausible it becomes to draw a single bright line between real humans and everything else. Instead, the late Pleistocene begins to look like a braided human landscape in which multiple populations possess overlapping capacities, distinct adaptations, and varying degrees of genetic and cultural interaction. Species names remain useful, but they do less ideological work than they once did. They mark evolutionary divergence, not moral rank. One lesser-known but important part of this shift lies in how scientists now handle uncertainty. Earlier generations often use uncertainty as permission to diminish Neanderthals. If there is no proof of art, assume no symbolic life. If there is no proof of a language, assume silence. If there is no proof of complex social structure, assume something crude. Modern research is more careful. The absence of clear evidence in prehistory is often the result of preservation bias, not proof of impossibility. Soft materials decay. Gesture leaves little trace. Intonation, memory, and belief almost never fossilize. This does not mean every hopeful speculation about Neanderthal minds should be accepted. It means the burden of interpretation has changed. They're no longer presumed deficient simply because the record is incomplete. At the same time, there is a risk in the opposite direction. As Neanderthals become more familiar, modern culture sometimes tries to rescue them by making them simply us, in heavier bodies, modern humans in fur clothing who differ only cosmetically from later populations. That is another distortion. The point is not to erase difference, but to understand it without hierarchy. Neanderthals are their own kind of human shaped by their own deep history, their own ecological pressures, and their own way of inhabiting Eurasia. Their minds, social lives, and cultural practices may overlap greatly with ours in some respects, and diverge in others we still cannot measure. Respect does not require sameness. In fact, the real lesson may be that humanity has once been capacious enough to include meaningful variation within the genus Homo itself. This broader definition of humanity carries a quiet ethical force as well. It reminds the modern world that intelligence and social life do not justify arrogance simply because one branch survives. We're used to being alone now, and solitude can breed myths of inevitability. It can make survival feel like proof of rightful dominance. Neanderthals challenge that instinct. They ask us to reckon with the fact that another human species once tended fires, cared for its vulnerable, crossed, dangerous ground-shaped tools with practiced hands, and endured for hundreds of thousands of years, only to be erased as a distinct people within a geologically recent instant. If that can happen to them, then our own permanence should never be taken for granted. There is something else here too, something almost philosophical in its weight. Modern humans often define themselves by contrast not just against animals, but against the imagined non-human past. We tell ourselves that language, symbol, care, planning and self-awareness mark the threshold we crossed alone. Neanderthals make that threshold harder to locate cleanly. Some of these traits appear shared, some contested, some differently expressed. The old category of only human begins to crack. In its place comes a more difficult idea that humanity is not a singular essence discovered once and for all, but a cluster of capacities once distributed across more than one lineage, each carrying them in its own form and degree. This is why Neanderthals keep returning in modern thought. They are not merely interesting fossils, they are destabilizing fossils. They pull at the edges of the categories with which modern people describe themselves. They make us ask whether being human has always meant being one kind of creature, or whether it once meant belonging to a wider family of near equals some now gone, some still faintly present inside us. No single explanation settles that question completely, because scientific evidence can reveal anatomy, ancestry, and behavior more easily than it can reveal the full interior texture of personhood. But the direction of change is unmistakable. The definition has widened, and that widening is one of Neanderthals' greatest legacies. They do not merely add another branch to the family tree, they alter the shape of the tree itself in the human imagination. After them, the past is no longer a lonely corridor leading toward us. It is a room once occupied by more than one kind of person. It is a world in which the category human is richer, less tidy, and more vulnerable than modern solitude had allowed. By now then, the question is no longer just why Neanderthals disappeared, it is also what their disappearance did to us conceptually. It left Homo sapiens alone on the stage, and loneliness can distort memory. For thousands of years we forgot that the stage had ever been shared. The rediscovery of Neanderthals has begun correcting that amnesia. It has restored to the human past some of its lost plurality. And in doing so, it has made our own survival feel less like the natural order of things, and more like the final remainder of a much larger, stranger story. In the end, what lingers most is not the exact date of the last Neanderthal fire, or the last cave in which their tools were dropped and never taken up again. Those questions matter, and scholars will keep refining them, but the deeper force of the story lies elsewhere. It lies in the silence that follows. For hundreds of thousands of years, another human species exists in the world, with enough skill, endurance, memory, and social depth to hold vast stretches of Eurasia through changing climates and repeated dangers. They are not a passing anomaly. They are not a brief failure. They are a durable human presence. Then that presence narrows, thins, breaks into refuges, and disappears so completely that for most of later human history, no one knows they were ever here at all. A whole branch of humanity passes out of sight, and the surviving branch goes on alone. That solitude is easy to mistake for the natural state of things. It is not. It is an inheritance. The world of the present, with one surviving human species spread across every continent, feels ordinary only because every nearby alternative has already been lost. The Neanderthal story restores the strangeness of that fact. It reminds us that humanity is not always singular. It once includes neighbours close enough to share landscapes, Prey shelters genes and perhaps ideas. Their disappearance, therefore, is not only biological, it is historical and existential. The human world becomes smaller when they go. Something plural collapses into something solitary. There is no need to make that ending more dramatic than it already is. No last battle is required, no final speech, no doomed stand beneath a crimson sky. Deep time is rarely so theatrical. More often it works through attrition, a few fewer births, a few more bad winters. A valley no longer worth crossing. A neighbouring group that never arrives this season. A child who does not survive. A hunt that fails. A route forgotten because no one is left to teach it. A community absorbed into another. Another reduced below recovery. Another gone quietly in a refuge far from any witness. Extinction in this form is not one moment but the cumulative triumph of silence over continuity. And that silence has a peculiar cruelty because Neanderthals are so close to recognition. If they were stranger, their loss might feel more distant. If they were identical to us, their story might collapse into our own and lose its edge. But they occupy a harder position. They're near enough to unsettle us and separate enough to remain partly unreachable. We can see their strength in bone, their competence in stone, their persistence in geography, their intimacy in DNA. We can see that they belong fully to the human past. What we cannot recover is the inner sound of their world. We do not know the names they gave to places. We do not know how they mourned in private, how they warned children away from danger, how they remembered the dead, what they noticed first in a changing season, or what it felt like, if they felt it at all, when the familiar human presence in the wider world began to diminish. That lost interiority is part of why the ending remains so powerful. Neanderthals do not vanish into abstraction once the science improves. In some ways they become more vivid, and therefore more difficult to lose. Every new method brings them closer. Ancient DNA makes them kin. Isotope studies place them in food webs and climates. Sediment analysis finds them even where bones are missing. Dental calculus preserves traces of meals. Healed injuries reveal care. Sites repeated over generations reveal attachment to place. The more details emerge, the more impossible it becomes to treat them as footnotes. Their extinction is no longer the disappearance of a crude evolutionary side branch. It is the disappearance of a people, and yet their ending is not absolute in every sense. That too is part of the unsettling beauty of the story. Some Neanderthals leave descendants within Homo sapiens populations. Small fragments of their inheritance move onward in the people who survive them. Their world does not persist, but traces of their bodies do. Their camps vanish, but not every part of them is lost. This does not undo the disappearance. It complicates it. The line between extinction and absorption blurs at the edges. Another human species vanishes, but not without entering the biological future of the species that remains. The result is a strange kind of afterlife. No Neanderthal community survives to tell its own story, yet the living human world still carries quiet evidence that these vanished people were once close enough to touch us. No single explanation fully accounts for why they disappear, and we do not. Climate matters, numbers matter, fragmentation matters, competition matters, interbreeding matters, disease may matter, timing matters, luck may matter more than modern pride prefers to admit. That perhaps is one of the hardest truths buried in the story. Survival is not always a certificate of superiority. Sometimes it is the outcome of a complicated convergence that favors one branch and not another. Neanderthals do not fail because they are lesser beings. They fail to remain because the world they are built to survive begins changing faster than their shrinking social and demographic systems can absorb. while another human lineage, our own, proves more expansive, more connected, and more able to endure the narrowing. So the final legacy of Neanderthals is not only the evidence they leave behind, it is the correction they force upon the living. They teach that the human story is older, stranger, and less lonely in its origins than we once believed. They teach that intelligence, care, adaptation, and endurance are not monopolies of Homo sapiens. They teach that extinction can happen not to monsters or mistakes, but to people who are in many ways recognizably like us. And perhaps most of all, they teach that the world we now inhabit, a world with only one kind of human left, is not the original design of things. It is what remains after a larger human family has already been reduced. The caves are quiet now. The stone tools lie where hands once dropped them. The hearths are cold. Wind passes cave mouths that once held warmth. Smoke animal grease sleeping bodies, wounded bodies, watchful bodies listening for danger in the dark. The valleys they knew have changed shape. Forests have advanced and retreated. Rivers have shifted. Coasts have moved. Entire climates have come and gone. Homo sapiens have built villages, then cities, then states, then networks spanning the planet. Through all of that, the Neanderthals remain absent except where the earth gives them back in fragments. A skull, a tooth, a genome, a stain of ash, a cut mark on bone. And from those fragments comes the final unsettling recognition. Another human species lived alongside us. It endured for longer than recorded history can easily comprehend. It met us, mingled with us, retreated before us, and then vanished forever as a separate people. We are not only the descendants of survival, we are the descendants of a world that became less crowded, less varied, less shared. In that sense, the silence after the Neanderthals is not empty. It is the sound of a lost human world and of our own species learning far too late that it was never alone to begin with. Word count 1572. The wind down begins where their story ends, in places that still hold the shape of old shelter, long after the lives inside them have vanished. A cave mouth facing a cold plain, a sheltered slope above a river, a narrow coastal refuge where the air tastes faintly of salt and stone. These places remain even when the people who knew them best do not. Sediment gathers, water drips, time closes over ash, and somewhere within those quiet layers rests the memory of another humanity, not preserved in words but in traces, patient enough to wait tens of thousands of years before being seen again. Perhaps that is the most humbling part of the whole story. The earth does not keep monuments to Neanderthals, it keeps fragments, enough to prove they were here, enough to show that they endured, adapted, cared, hunted, taught, and survived through ages of cold and danger. Enough to show that their disappearance was not trivial, but never enough to fully restore the sound of their world. The silence remains incomplete, and maybe it always will. What survives in the record suggests much. It also withholds much. That is the nature of deep time. It reveals with one hand and erases with the other. Still, even in fragments, they change the way the present looks. The modern world can feel crowded with people, and yet strangely lonely in species terms. We're used to being the only human beings alive, used to imagining that as normal. Neanderthals remind us that this was not always so. There was once another fire in the dark, another set of hands shaping stone, another face turned toward winter weather, another mind watching the same herds move through the same valleys. Their world did not end in spectacle. It thinned, narrowed, and went quiet. And after a long enough silence, we forgot it had ever existed. Now the forgetting is over. The bones have returned. The genomes have spoken in their strange molecular way. The old caves are no longer empty of meaning, And if there is any final image worth holding on to, it may be this evening falling over an Ice Age landscape, wind moving through grass or brush smoke lifting from a shelter where a small human group gathers close against the cold. For a while that light belongs to them. Then after ages it goes out. The land remains, the night remains, and only much later from ashen bone and buried traces do we realize how much vanished with that fading fire.